in intense fighting against the armed forces of the DRC and their allies. There are horrifying reports of rape, sexual slavery, and summary executions. More than 500,000 people have been forced to flee this year, adding to almost 7.8 million people already displaced in the country. The violence must stop. Violations by all parties must be investigated, and dialogue must resume. In Myanmar, 2024 was the deadliest year for civilians since the military coup 4 years ago. The military ramped up brutal attacks on civilians as their grip on power eroded, with retaliatory airstrikes and artillery shelling of villages and urban areas, arbitrary arrests and prosecutions, and the forcible conscription of thousands of young people. I urge the international community to cut decisively the supply of arms and finance that enable the military's vicious repression. In Haiti, gang violence spiraled out of control last year. More than 5,600 people were killed and thousands more were injured or kidnapped. Deep economic and social inequalities have been exacerbated by violence, including sexual violence and violence against children. Over 1 million people are internally displaced, half of them children. Full implementation of the Security Council's arms embargo and support to the multinational security support mission are crucial to resolving this crisis. Hostilities in and around Yemen continue with an alarming impact on the human rights and humanitarian situation. Almost 20 million Yemenis need humanitarian support. I'm outraged by the death of a World Food Programme colleague in detention earlier this month. All 23 UN staff, including 8 colleagues from my own office, who are arbitrarily detained by the Houthis, must be released immediately. Mr. President, conflict causes chaos, but it arises from its own twisted logic. Some people, autocrats, demagogues, profiteers, benefit from that chaos, whether through divide and rule tactics, predatory business practices, or simple theft. Conflict bleeds into all our lives, from the products we buy to the news feeds we scroll, from minerals mined in war zones to the so-called bot farms and scam centers that flourish in the most lawless corners of the world. We're all somewhat implicated, and we all have a responsibility to act through our consumption habits, our social media use, and our political and social engagement. Accountability is key, making sure perpetrators of abuses and violations are held to account for their crimes. We can trace a clear line between the lack of accountability for airstrikes on hospitals in Syria in the 2010s, attacks on healthcare facilities in Yemen, and the destruction of health systems in Gaza and Sudan. According to one study, 2023 was the deadliest year for healthcare workers in a decade. Some 480 were killed during armed conflict, nearly double the previous year. Accountability remedies the past and protects the future. Last month, for example, a Swedish court convicted an ISIS-affiliated woman of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes against the Yazidis in 2015. A court in Mexico recently upheld the conviction of 5 military officers for the extrajudicial executions of university students in 2010. And ongoing investigations by the International Criminal Court into various situations create hope of justice for victims everywhere. Around the world, civil society, lawyers, and victims are calling on warring parties to respect international law and pursue avenues of accountability. States need to be put on notice that the world is watching, including on arms transfers to conflict zones. Beyond states, corporations must also be held to account, including for damage to our climate and our environment. In December, for example, the Supreme Court of Kenya reaffirmed a landmark decision awarding compensation for deaths caused by lead poisoning. I'm also encouraged by a growing wave of litigation that seeks to hold fossil fuel companies to account for climate-related damage. But these cases are the exception rather than the rule. In this connection, I urge the European Union to maintain robust human rights and environmental due diligence at the heart of their corporate sustainability laws as they consider reforms. Mr. President, an absence of accountability leads directly to an absence of peace. And yet, a tireless search for peace is what the world needs most. Preemptive strikes cannot replace preventive diplomacy. Today, wars are lasting longer and peace negotiations are less successful. According to one study, the number of conflicts that ended through peace agreements fell from 23% in the 1970s to 4% in the 2010s. For millions of people around the world, war has become a simple, devastating fact of life. This should shake us all. We need to build peace from the ground up, to grasp it, nurture it, protect it, and promote it at every opportunity. Bring warring parties to the table, ensure that women are involved from beginning to end, build peace around human rights. Transitional justice seeks to do exactly that. It helps fractured societies to heal, reconcile, and rebuild. We see its impact all over the world. In Liberia, my office's support has played an important part in advancing transitional justice and promoting accountability. Establishing the Office of a War and Economic Crimes Court last May, was a significant step towards justice for victims of the civil wars between 1989 and 2003. In Colombia, we are reminded of the importance of the participation of civil society in peace-building efforts, notably women, Afro-descendants, and indigenous peoples. Peace requires constant vigilance as part of a sustained, victim-centered transitional justice process. The design and implementation of Ethiopia's transitional justice process will be key to demonstrating its ability to address past violations. This is a fragile moment. The human rights situation continued to be dire in 2024, notably in the Amhara and Oromia regions. The situation in Tigray has improved since the cessation of hostilities agreement, but tensions remain high. Worryingly, civic space has become more restricted throughout the country. Proposed amendments to the media law put the rights to freedom of expression, association, and peaceful assembly at risk. None of these steps are conducive to sustainable peace. The Western Balkans are an example of transitional justice delayed. Almost 30 years after the end of the conflict in Bosnia and Herzegovina, more progress on peace building, economic and social reforms, and the protection of human rights are badly needed. Across the whole region, leaders must abandon ethno-nationalist agendas and revisionist narratives that justify or deny atrocity crimes and glorify convicted war criminals. My office is working to get transitional justice back on track. I'm following closely the ongoing peace negotiations between Armenia and Azerbaijan in the hope that they will lead to a process of truth-telling, healing, and reconciliation. We stand ready to support. All those arbitrarily detained in Azerbaijan, including ethnic Armenians, must be released immediately, and fair trial rights must be respected fully. Bangladesh last year experienced a paroxysm of violence as the government of the time brutally suppressed a student movement that carried human rights at its torch. The country is now charting a new future. Our recent independent fact-finding report on the grave human rights violations that took place is an important contribution to this journey. I hope it will support truth-telling, accountability, reparations, healing, and reform. It will be crucial to ensure due process in criminal cases and investigate revenge violence, including against minorities. Syria is also at a critical turning point. My office, together with local and international organizations, raised the alarms and documented appalling human rights violations and abuses for over 14 years before the regime was ousted. This record can now support justice and truth-telling. The interim authorities are facing difficult challenges, and we are ready to accompany them moving forward. I am concerned by reports of revenge violence and abuses. The authorities have an opportunity now to deliver on Syrians' expectations, guided by the human rights of all Syrians, regardless of their gender, ethnicity, religion, and race. Women must play a full role in all transitional institutions and decisions. When I visited Lebanon earlier this year, I was encouraged by the commitment of the new leadership to human rights. The country now has a unique opportunity to embark on legal reforms and address deep inequalities and other social and economic issues. These will be crucial to restore social cohesion, build public confidence in state institutions, and deliver on the aspirations of the Lebanese people. Mr. President, even in societies that are nominally at peace, people are feeling insecure and unmoored. Communities and societies struggle with polarization and division, which are anathema to human rights. I have followed recent election campaigns in Europe, North America, and beyond with increasing trepidation. Single-issue sound bites, devoid of substance, oversimplify complex issues, and are often based on scapegoating, disinformation, and dehumanization. Migration, for example, is an age-old phenomenon that can be addressed to everyone's benefit. Refugees fleeing persecution are entitled to live in safety, free from harassment. And yet, migrants and refugees are widely labeled as illegals, criminals, vermin, or worse. We have heard these terms before. Excessive use of force and deaths of people of African descent at the hands of law enforcement officials persist, often rooted in systemic racism. Other communities face deep-seated, caste-based discrimination related to work and descent. LGBTIQ+ people, particularly transgender people, continue to face high levels of violence, harassment, and discrimination in all regions of the world. People with disabilities face discrimination, bias, and stigma every day. Dehumanization is a well-worn step towards treating an entire group as outsiders, unworthy of the basic rights we all enjoy. It is a dangerous precursor to hate and violence and must be called out whenever it occurs. Mr. President, from autocracies to democracies, women and girls are denied their rights in myriad ways. In Afghanistan, women and girls are subject to state-sponsored gender apartheid that is unparalleled in today's world. Virtual prisoners within their homes, they are denied the most basic and fundamental freedoms essential to normal life, including movement, education, and work. I'm deeply concerned for the long-term future of a country that is self-harming on a national scale. In Iran, the hijab law has been temporarily suspended, and I call again on the authorities to repeal the law fully and permanently, along with all other laws and practices that discriminate against women and girls. I also urge them to release all human rights defenders from detention and to end arbitrary arrests and imprisonment. I'm deeply troubled by the marked increase in executions last year, with over 900 reported cases. I've urged the Iranian authorities to place an immediate moratorium on the use of the death penalty. More broadly, I'm concerned about the resurgence in some quarters of toxic ideas about masculinity and efforts to glorify gender stereotypes, especially among young men. It is shocking to me that misogynistic influencers have millions of followers on social media and are hailed as heroes in some quarters. Online and offline, these ideas are translating into a wider pushback against gender equality, as well as violence and hateful rhetoric against women, human rights defenders, and women politicians. We see these trends across all regions, from Latin America and Africa to East Asia, Europe, North America, and beyond. In some cases, they are making their way into reforms to laws and policies and risk reversing hard-won gains on gender equality. While more than 60 countries and territories have liberalized their abortion laws over the past 30 years, we are now seeing attempted rollbacks in many countries. 40% of women globally live under restrictive abortion laws. As always, it is the most marginalized women who suffer most. Mr. President, we have enjoyed bipartisan support from the United States of America on human rights over many decades, thanks to the generosity and compassion of the American people. I'm now deeply worried by the fundamental shift in direction that is taking place domestically and internationally. In a paradoxical mirror image, policies intended to protect people from discrimination are now labeled as discriminatory. Progress is being rolled back on gender equality. Disinformation, intimidation, and threats, notably against journalists and public officials, risk undermining the work of independent media and the functioning of institutions. Divisive rhetoric is being used to distort, deceive, and polarize. This is generating fear and anxiety among many. On these issues and more, my office will continue building on our long history of constructive engagement. Mr. President, societies need certain ingredients to thrive: a free public square with space for open debate, free and independent media, an independent judiciary, and transparent and representative state institutions. But when I look around the world, I see a troubling picture. In Nicaragua, the recent constitutional reform significantly increases the concentration of power in the presidency and dismantles checks and balances. Fundamental rights are at risk of being further curtailed, including the elimination of the prohibition of torture. I urge the Nicaraguan authorities to return to a democratic path and pursue a meaningful and constructive dialogue to this end. In Venezuela, I noted the announcement that more than 1,000 people were released after being detained following the presidential elections. All those arbitrarily detained must be released immediately. Political negotiations between the different stakeholders are urgently needed to agree to a viable pathway forward. I call for all electoral processes to be transparent, inclusive, peaceful, and fully in line with international human rights standards. In Argentina, I'm troubled by recent executive actions that bypass established procedures for Supreme Court appointments, which risk undermining the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. I also have serious concerns about the effect of austerity policies on the growing number of people living in poverty. In Mozambique, I call for the impartial and independent investigation into human rights violations and abuses which took place in the post-election period. My office is ready to work together with the new government and civil society to advance respect and protection of human rights in the country, including to strengthen human rights compliance of security forces. We have received many reports about a continued crackdown in the Russian Federation on civil society and independent media under the guise of national security. Stringent laws have been adopted to stifle free expression, labeling critical voices as foreign agents or undesirable organizations. Many journalists and activists, including anti-war protesters, have faced harassment, arrest, or exile, resulting in the near elimination of any form of dissent within the country. In Belarus, severe limitations on freedom of expression, association, and assembly persist, and human rights activism has all but disappeared. I note the recent series of releases from detention and call on the authorities to free all those who remain arbitrarily detained. While China is engaging with the international human rights system, I refer back to my previous updates, raising serious concerns and hope to see meaningful progress on these issues. I continue to make representations on behalf of lawyers, human rights defenders, and citizen journalists who have been arbitrarily detained under vague criminal offenses. In Hong Kong SAR, the broad application of national security laws continues to stifle civic space. The recent report by the International Labour Organization experts on counter-terrorism measures and labor programs in the Xinjiang region reinforce our own grave concerns and the urgency of addressing our long-standing recommendations. I'm also concerned by the impact of education policies and continued restrictions on freedom of expression, religion, and belief in the Tibet Autonomous Region. I will take these issues forward in our ongoing engagement. In Thailand, I remain troubled by the dissolution of the Move Forward Party last August and the legal cases being pursued against its leaders. This impacts people's right to participate in public affairs and political life. Given last week's deportation of ethnic Uyghurs, I also call on Thailand to respect the fundamental principle of non-refoulement. India's democracy and institutions have been its greatest strength, underpinning its diversity and development. Democracy requires constant nurturing of participation and inclusion at all levels of society. I am concerned by the use of restrictive laws and harassment against human rights defenders and independent journalists, resulting in arbitrary detention and a diminished civic space, including in Kashmir. I also call for stepped-up efforts to address violence and displacement in Manipur based on dialogue, peace-building, and human rights. Civic space is shrinking in Egypt, where the authorities are using anti-terrorism legislation against those expressing dissent, including human rights defenders, journalists, bloggers, and peaceful demonstrators. These practices are creating fear, silencing critical voices, and hindering participation of human rights defenders in international human rights processes. I reiterate my call for the release of all those detained for exercising their human rights. We are seeing similar trends in other countries, including Algeria and Tunisia. Mr. President, on a more general note, I'm particularly concerned by the growing phenomenon of targeting journalists, human rights defenders, and political dissidents across borders using technology to track them. This insidious practice is used to intimidate, threaten, silence, detain, forcibly disappear, and even kill opponents and critics. It sends a clear message that no place is safe and leaves people living in a constant state of fear. Globally, the number of direct physical incidents of transnational repression has been rising since 2020, with egregious examples from around the world. We have observed in particular a pattern of abductions, disappearances, in some cases killings in mainland Southeast Asia. I urge all states to adopt a zero-tolerance policy to extra legal transfers, renditions, and abductions, and to ensure full accountability for these violations, as well as respect for the principle of non-refoulement. Mr. President, today's massive shifts and profound transformations have left people in many countries around the world feeling alienated and abandoned. They believe their grievances and fears for the future are not taken seriously. As a result, they have lost trust in political leadership and institutions, which leads to more fragmentation. My response is, your concerns are our concerns, because they are about human rights, to education, to health, to housing, to free speech and access to justice. Human rights are about people's daily concerns for their families and their future. They are also about equity, global solidarity, and sustainable development. Human rights can never be played off against each other. They reinforce each other and reveal how we are all connected. The solution to today's pervasive unease lies in more respect for human rights, not less. It lies in uniting around more effective and efficient multilateral institutions and frameworks that protect us all. I'm deeply troubled by efforts from a number of countries to undermine and inhibit the functioning of international legal frameworks and institutions, including the International Criminal Court, which is a fundamental pillar of international criminal justice. I'm stunned by the ease with which various international institutions are cast aside with measures that hinder the vital work they and their staff carry out. Mr. President, economic systems must deliver on economic, social, cultural, civil and political rights, the right to development, and the right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. The Paris Agreement is an essential tool. We need a laser focus on stopping the climate crisis in its tracks and protecting those already feeling the heat. The World Health Organization plays an essential role in preventing pandemics and safeguarding people's well-being. Sweeping cuts to domestic social safety nets, climate finance, and foreign aid signal a massive setback for human rights protection, for conflict prevention, and for global stability. Social security, humanitarian and development aid, climate finance, and national security are not in opposition. They are mutually reinforcing. Mr. President, today, power dynamics are changing. Individuals and corporations have never had so much control and influence over our lives. A handful of unelected tech oligarchs have our data. They know where we live, what we do, our genes and our health conditions, our thoughts, our habits, our desires, and our fears. They know us better than we know ourselves, and they know how to manipulate us. Any form of unregulated power can lead to oppression, subjugation, and even tyranny, the playbook of the autocrat. We must adapt fast. States must fulfill their duty to protect people from unchecked power and work together to achieve this. Mr. President, in response to all the challenges I've outlined, we need to bring back the value of science, knowledge, and facts. And we need a clear, unequivocal commitment to the rule of law, to transparency, to independent institutions, all anchored in human rights. We also need a global coalition pushing for an alternative vision based on wisdom, justice, and compassion. Last week, I was struck how many leaders from all regions of the world are united around the cause of human rights. We must inspire with our values and demonstrate that human rights are a winning proposition for humanity. We must cherish the values of respect, unity, and solidarity, and work together for a safer, more just, more sustainable world. We can and will persevere. Merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Haut-Commissaire. Excellences, distingués collègues, nous allons maintenant reprendre le dialogue interactif sur la mise à jour orale du Haut-Commissaire sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Myanmar. Nous poursuivons la liste des orateurs et je donne la parole au distingué délégué de la Gambie. Gambia, you have the floor, please. Gambia. A microphone for the Gambia, please.
Good morning, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. President. My delegation thanks the High Commissioner for the comprehensive update and aligns itself with the statement delivered on behalf of the OIC. The Gambian notes with deep concern the assessment of the deteriorating human rights situation in Myanmar, particularly regarding the plight of the Rohingya minority. We reiterate our call on the international community to intensify efforts to protect the Rohingya, ensure unimpeded humanitarian access, and facilitate their safe, dignified, and voluntary return to their homeland. Furthermore, we stress the urgent need for accountability for human rights violations. In this regard, we welcome the recent request by the Chief Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court for an arrest warrant against Myanmar's military leaders for crimes against humanity. The Gambia reaffirms its commitment to pursuing justice through the International Court of Justice and stands ready to collaborate with all stakeholders to restore peace and uphold human dignity in Myanmar. In conclusion, we ask, what specific measures would the Human Rights Council's office recommend to the international community to effectively protect the Rohingya population in Myanmar and hold perpetrators accountable? And I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thailand appreciates the High Commissioner's oral update. Thailand is deeply concerned over the ongoing violence and escalation of conflict in Myanmar. As an immediate neighbor, Thailand is committed to helping Myanmar to find peaceful solutions through meaningful engagement with all stakeholders. Last December, Thailand hosted 2 meetings related to the situation in Myanmar, namely the sixth country informal consultation, which was the first time that Myanmar and all its neighboring countries met to discuss issues of common concerns, and the extended informal consultation, where ASEAN member states discuss how to advance the implementation of the 5-point consensus. Thailand also continues to attach importance to providing humanitarian assistance to Myanmar. Throughout last year, we have contributed through ASEAN and various international organizations to alleviate the suffering of the people in Myanmar. As the number of people from Myanmar crossing over into Thailand continues to increase, Thailand will step up efforts to promote and protect the rights of these migrants. We have recently adopted the policy framework for humanitarian assistance along the Thai-Myanmar border in the areas of public health and education. We look forward to working with the international community and all stakeholders in this endeavor. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. We take note of the High Commissioner's report on the human rights situation in Myanmar. Regarding the continued violence and humanitarian crisis in Myanmar, we urge all parties to exercise restraint, cease hostilities, and engage in meaningful dialogue. Vietnam expresses hope that the situation in Myanmar will soon stabilize so that its citizens can start rebuilding and developing the country and continue contributing to the creation of a united and strong ASEAN community. We also welcome the international community's humanitarian assistance to help Myanmar overcome the consequences of natural disasters and epidemics. At the same time, we closely cooperate with the ASEAN Chair and member states to help Myanmar find a feasible and sustainable solution to the ongoing crisis, to implement ASEAN's 5-point consensus, and to promote peace, stability, cooperation, and development in the region. We look forward to continued coordination and support from the United Nations and other partners to further ASEAN's ongoing efforts. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Philippines remains deeply concerned with the escalation of conflicts and humanitarian situation in Myanmar. We wish to reiterate that human rights and the rules of armed conflict must be upheld at all times and by all state and non-state actors alike. The Philippines is fully behind the ASEAN 5-point consensus, which remains the main reference in addressing the complex political crisis in Myanmar. We urge all parties to cease hostilities, engage in dialogue in good faith, and ensure that humanitarian aid reaches those in need. We call on our international partners to increase support to ASEAN's humanitarian efforts based on the joint needs assessment of the ASEAN Humanitarian Center, as well as to ASEAN's committed endeavor to carry out the 5-point consensus in its entirety and with the urgency the situation merits. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of India.
Mr. President, we thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. As an immediate neighbor and friend of the people of Myanmar, India has always accorded a high priority to the maintenance of peace and stability in Myanmar and its economic development. The ongoing situation in Myanmar has led to an influx of thousands of people into our northeastern states and an increase in instances of drugs and human trafficking. We take the floor today to reiterate our deep concern over the precarious humanitarian and security situation in Myanmar and call for the immediate cessation of violence by all sides, the release of political detainees, humanitarian assistance, and the resolution of the crisis through constructive dialogue. India remains steadfast in its support to Myanmar's transition towards inclusive federal democracy and to the need for arriving at peaceful solutions that are Myanmar-led and Myanmar-owned. India supports the ASEAN-led efforts and the ASEAN 5-point consensus, and we continue to closely coordinate our policy with ASEAN in this regard. We will continue with our initiatives to strengthen the democratic processes, people-centric projects, and capacity-building initiatives in Myanmar, and call on the international community to work together in pragmatic and constructive ways to support the people of Myanmar and facilitate a return to peace and stability. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, High Commissioner, for your update. We are now in the 4th year since the coup, and the crisis in Myanmar is only deepening. The military continues to intensify its violent and repressive onslaught. Schools and hospitals have been targeted. Indiscriminate airstrikes on civilians have increased. There is no justification for abhorrent attacks on innocent civilians. The UK is alarmed by the escalating violence, human rights violations, and gender-based violence. All actors, especially the Myanmar military, must prioritise the protection of civilians. We call on the military to stop the violence, especially the airstrikes, and release all those arbitrarily detained. The humanitarian situation is critical, with almost 20 million people in need of assistance. We call on all actors, especially the military, to allow safe and unimpeded humanitarian access. The UK is providing more than £66 million in assistance this year. Accountability is vital. We must break the cycle of impunity. This is why the UK supports the work of the International Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, and this is why we announced our 19th round of sanctions in November last year, targeting the military regime's access to arms, aviation fuel, and dual-use equipment. Thank you.
Merci. Nous allons maintenant passer à la liste des orateurs des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme et des organisations non gouvernementales. Je donne la parole à Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development par video.
Mr. President, we welcome High Commissioner update and his continuous engagement on Myanmar. With the significant escalation of the crisis in Myanmar last year, in particular in Rakhine State, Rohingya in Myanmar are once again facing existential risks. The Arkan Army and United League of Arkan, which now control Rakhine State, have an important decision to make. Whether Rakhine remains locked in conflict, division, and poverty, or all people of Rakhine, regardless of race or religion, work together for a better future. We urge Arkan Army to reject military systematic policies and exclusion and ensure those under its command immediately cease all abuses against Rohingya or any other ethnic or religious group in Rakhine State. The Rohingya must be recognized as an integral part of Rakhine's diverse community. For too long, our identity has been erased or our existence denied. Regular and meaningful dialogue with Rohingya leaders is critical for addressing grievances, rebuilding trust, and fostering understanding. Justice and accountability must be at the core of any resolution in this crisis. Last month, Argentinian court issued international arrest warrants for Me Online and other perpetrators of genocide and other grave crimes. This effort alongside cases at the ICJ and ICC are critical in ensuring those responsible face justice. The future of the Rohingya cannot be one of endless displacement, persecution, and uncertainty. We Rohingya want to return home, but only with guarantees of rights, protection, and accountability. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Edmund Rice International Limited.
President, we welcome the High Commissioner's oral update and concur with the recommendations. Children and youth in Myanmar are experiencing immense challenges in accessing education due to the ongoing bombing of schools by the Myanmar Armed Forces, internet disruptions, widespread displacement, and forced recruitment. In the absence of formal education, informal educational programs aligned with the National Unity Government are continuing. Teachers are conducting remote classes while students fleeing the violence take exams in jungles or bomb shelters. The military junta refuses to recognise such education, leading to the arrest of teachers and bombing of associated locations. Forced recruitment of children and conscription of youth have disrupted access to education. In January 2025, Yangon authorities began listing women eligible for military service, signalling plans to draft women. Refugee children and youth from Myanmar struggle to access formal education in neighbouring countries, limiting their future employment opportunities. We need to protect and fulfil the right to education for children and youth of Myanmar to avoid the risk of having a lost generation. We call on members of the Council to 1. Urge the Myanmar State Administration Council to recognise informal educational programs carried out in cooperation with the National Unity Government. 2. Urge neighbouring countries to guarantee access to quality education for refugee children. And 3. Call on all parties to the conflict to immediately halt all recruitment of children and youth. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Federation for Human Rights Leagues.
Mr. President, FIDH and its members, ASEAN Burma and Women's Peace Network, thank the High Commissioner for his oral update. UN member states must reject the illegal junta's proposed election that excludes Rohingya and the political parties that won 97% of seats in 2020. Preparation for the so-called election saw an unprecedented rise in violence against civilians last year. As the number of political prisoners approaches 22,000, we urge UN members, particularly ASEAN governments, to increase efforts for their release. Attacks against Rohingya men, women, and children by both the junta and the Arakan army must stop. We are concerned the junta's recent release of Rohingya prisoners is a ploy to forcibly conscript them. We urge ASEAN states to stop deporting people to feed the junta's forced conscription drive. We welcome the Bangladeshi interim government's consent to the independent investigative mechanism on Myanmar to travel there to conduct its important work and urge other regional neighbors to do the same. We urge all states to help Argentina execute the arrest warrants issued over the Rohingya genocide. We urge the US government to reverse its disastrous suspension of aid to organizations helping Myanmar refugees, including on the Thai and Bangladeshi borders, and to groups including women and LGBTIQ peacefully working for human rights and democracy.
Thank you. I give the floor to Advocates for Human Rights.
For Human Rights is a member of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. We take this opportunity to highlight human rights violations concerning the death penalty in Myanmar. The Special Rapporteur's March 2024 report states that military tribunals and courts within prisons have sentenced 166 political prisoners to death. Multiple reports allege that court proceedings often take place in secret and do not respect fair trial standards. In September 2024, authorities executed a husband and wife alleged to be anti-coup activists, the first since 2022. 5 additional pro-democracy activists, including one woman, were at imminent risk of execution and had reportedly experienced brutal torture, including sexual violence. We are also concerned that as recently as December 2024, the Myanmar National Democratic Alliance Army has been sentencing people to death and carrying out summary public executions. We urge all parties to the conflict to cease executions and to commute all death sentences to penalties that are fair, proportionate, and consistent with international human rights standards. We urge all parties to provide a full accounting of all death sentences and executions since 2021, disaggregated by sex or gender, crime of conviction, court of conviction, and relationship to any co-defendants or victims. We emphasize the importance of respecting the safeguards, guaranteeing protection of the rights of those facing the death penalty, particularly that the legal process must have all possible safeguards to ensure a fair trial. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Mr. President. CSW thanks the High Commissioner for his update on the situation in Myanmar. The military junta has persistently employed forms of psychological, physical, and sexual torture in its campaign of violence across the country. The use of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment targeting religious and ethnic minorities, including those arbitrarily detained without due process, is particularly concerning. Detained Buddhist monks face severe mistreatment, including psychological torture and beatings. They are often forced to disrobe of their monastic attire and denied essential practices. Any refusal to comply results in physical assault. The ongoing affliction of torture during military interrogations has resulted in the death of religious leaders, including Christian pastor Salai Ngwe Kaya in 2021 and a Muslim man in Yangon, Koko Lat, who was forcibly recruited by the junta under conscription law and died from torture and fatal beatings in 2024. The military junta's inhumane treatment towards religious minorities and clergy evidences a broader strategy to suppress dissent and erode minority religious identities. CSW calls on the Myanmar military to cease its targeting of religious and ethnic minorities and to end the use of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. We further urge the international community to increase efforts to address reports of unlawful detention and use of torture in Myanmar. High Commissioner, what more can be done to ensure specific support, protection, care, and treatment for survivors of torture and other forms of cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment in Myanmar? Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Juventum EV.
Mr. President, Mr. High Commissioner, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Juventum is honored to participate. While the military junta seems to have diminishing control over Myanmar, it has grown into more brutality and retaliatory actions, making the largest death toll since the beginning of the coup in 2021. As reported by the Special Rapporteur, some targeted sanctions brought positive outcomes to limit the military supply for the junta. The resistance shows enormous courage despite the general deficiency of support from the international community. The international community should speed up its support for the people seeking democracy and justice. The generation in productive ages is either forced to serve in the military or wants to flee to other countries. The youth should be provided with the education and the training for the development. The United Nations should provide online support for the youth in education and the capacity building from outside. Myanmar consists of huge diversity. A more robust democracy than before is needed. The international community is responsible for making suggestions on the unity and the recovery of Myanmar using the wisdom learned from good practices. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. I give the floor to International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute, the Law Council of Australia, Lawyers for Lawyers, and Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada continue to condemn the ongoing atrocity crimes being committed in Myanmar. Over 4 years since the coup, reports of the lack of the rule of law and of the junta targeting pro-democracy activists and human rights defenders, including lawyers and journalists, continue. Lawyers not only face severe restrictions in their work, including limited access to their clients and bans on confidential communications, but have themselves been harassed, intimidated, and arbitrarily arrested and detained, particularly when defending political cases. Arbitrary arrests and detention and unfair trials of perceived opponents of the military regime also continue. There is evidence of systematic torture and ill-treatment of individuals in detention, often to force a confession. Judges have reportedly summarily dismissed or not even considered lawyers or the accused's attempts to object to the reliance on such false confessions in judicial proceedings. We continue to urge, firstly, the High Commissioner and this Council to respond robustly to the deepening crisis in Myanmar, and secondly, the international community to use and support all possible avenues to ensure accountability for all international crimes that are being committed. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Southeast Asia Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Expression Caucus.
Excellency, we are deeply troubled by the impact of Myanmar military conscription law on the LGBTIQ individual. This law increases discrimination, violence, and forced displacement. Alarmingly, 70.3% of LGBTIQ individuals have been forcibly conscripted and 58.4% summoned, showing a harsh reality. LGBTIQ people are forced into a system that criminalizes their identity, endanger their safety, and strip away their dignity. This law is more than just about military service. It is used to silence queer voices and push many into hiding or exile. We call on the international community, including embassy, multilateral agency, and human rights organizations, to take immediate action. They must closely monitor and document these abuses, offer direct support to LGBTIQ defenders, and provide humanitarian assistance. We urge the United Nations and diplomatic body to pressure Myanmar's military regime to stop this violation. Neighboring countries should provide refuge and protection, and global sanctions should be imposed on the junta to halt further atrocity. The time to act is now. We must protect the rights, safety, and dignity of Myanmar LGBTIQ community. Thank you, Excellence.
Merci. Ceci était la dernière intervention qu'il nous est possible d'écouter et je redonne maintenant la parole au commissaire aux droits de l'homme pour ses remarques finales. Vous avez la parole.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I think many of us in the room have followed developments in Myanmar for many, many years. And I think whenever we go into these discussions, we follow them with a heavy heart. But one thing is good, that there is a discussion in the Human Rights Council about Myanmar, because if I look at the world attention, I have to say it's not necessarily the priority that it deserves. And it's important that as a result, not just what we are doing in terms of reporting, but also that there is a clear message from the Human Rights Council about how serious the situation is and how much we are all concerned about it. And frankly, if you go into the figures are appalling. A minimum of 6,353 civilians, including 733 children killed by the military, with 2024 the deadliest year so far, 21,922 prisoners in detention on political grounds, 2,294 individuals have died in military custody, over 3.5 million internally displaced people, over 144,000 have crossed borders, in addition to the 1.1 million Rohingya that are already in Bangladesh, nearly 20 million people in need of humanitarian assistance, 15 million people facing acute food insecurity and warnings of a famine in Rakhine State, half of the country living under the poverty line, an additional 25% on or just above it. I mean, and one can continue. It's also clear that the situation in Myanmar is not confined to its borders. We have already seen the consequences. We hear from Bangladesh how much they are shouldering in terms of responsibility by hosting Rohingya refugees. We have heard about the displacement across even the to other countries in Southeast Asia in particular. We have heard about the regional impacts because of the drug production. Myanmar now leads the world in producing opium. We've seen reports about trafficking and organized criminal networks and scam centers, transnational crime. There is a huge opportunity cost to the region in terms of economic loss, potential of the country unfulfilled. Many of us know the many talented people from this country, especially young people, who don't know what their future will be like. And this is definitely not a climate in which a flawed election process can offer any solution. Peace is indeed the most important one before any of this can be discussed. There were a number of delegations that asked questions mostly around accountability. As you know, the ICC prosecutor has taken the important step to seek an arrest warrant for Min Aung Hlaing, and he has announced that further applications are to follow. And it's important to recognize that indeed, apart from the situation in Rakhine State, I mean, in terms of the crimes that have been committed against the Rohingya, over which the ICC has jurisdiction, it's also important to ensure that the whole of the country is covered, because we have reported for so many years about what is happening. So, and I've said it before, in our considered assessment, it is important that the entire situation of Myanmar is referred to the International Criminal Court by the UN Security Council, because that would help end impunity and pressure the military to cease violence. I welcome the steps taken by 11 states so far to intervene formally in the case by the Gambia against Myanmar in the International Court of Justice under the Genocide Convention. I encourage also continued support, not only to the Special Rapporteur, but also cooperation with independent investigative mechanism for Myanmar, and for states to use universal jurisdiction for pursuing investigations and prosecutions at national levels. Because of course, universal jurisdiction allows for the prosecution of serious violations that have been committed in Myanmar. Then there were a number of questions around how to end the violence and find a pathway out of the crisis. I mean, it's clear that what is needed most is for the international community to engage with the full spectrum of democratic actors, ethnic groups, civil society, to find solutions. And we know the importance of that women and youth can play in defining a new vision for the country. As you know, I was asked by you, by the Human Rights Council, to submit a report in June, which will explore pathways for Myanmar to a democratic future. And we are really making a strong effort to consult widely with Myanmar stakeholders in the preparation of the report, particularly young people, because they have very clear ideas about what a democratic and inclusive future would look like. It is also important that there is engagement that looks at governance systems, even at the local level, outside the military's control, because they are protecting and providing services to people. There is a need for a comprehensive dialogue, again, that involves all stakeholders. And importantly, because we have seen the funding cuts, it's absolutely critical not only to support Bangladesh and to make sure that there are also support given on the humanitarian side. We heard what ASEAN is doing with ARA, but also beyond this, to ensure that humanitarian human rights organizations and journalists that are still working on the ground are supported. The last point that I want to say is that we know from other situations that there will always be a day after. And very often we're not prepared for the day after. At some stage, this brutal repression will end, and it is absolutely critical that we are prepared for the day after, with a vision that the people of Myanmar will define themselves, that we hope to accompany, so that we are really ready to provide the support that is required. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Ceci nous amène à la fin de ce dialogue interactif et je tiens à remercier le haut-commissaire pour sa participation. Excellences, distingués collègues, nous allons maintenant procéder à la présentation des rapports du Haut-Commissariat sur la question des droits de l'homme à Chypre, au Guatemala, au Honduras et en Colombie. Nous entendrons également des mises à jour orales sur les progrès en matière de réconciliation et de responsabilité à Sri Lanka et sur la situation des droits de l'homme au Nicaragua. J'ai l'honneur de donner la parole à Madame Marit Kohonen-Sherif, directrice de la division des opérations mondiales du Haut-Commissariat des droits de l'homme. S'il vous plaît, Madame.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I have the honor to present today the reports of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Colombia, Guatemala, and Honduras. I'll also provide an update on the human rights situation in Nicaragua, present the office's report on Cyprus, and conclude with an oral update on Sri Lanka. Señor Presidente, empiezo con el informe sobre Colombia, A/HRC/58/24. Quisiera iniciar felicitando a Colombia por su elección por primera vez como miembro del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y por su apertura continua con nuestra oficina y el Sistema Internacional de Derechos Humanos. No obstante, sigue siendo objeto de gran preocupación la violencia ejercida por los grupos armados no estatales en contra de la población civil, con el fin de ejercer control territorial y explotar economías ilícitas, socavando la gobernabilidad. Esta violencia afecta desproporcionadamente a pueblos indígenas, comunidades afrodescendientes y campesinas. Frente a esta violencia, reiteramos la urgencia de una presencia integral del Estado en todo el territorio nacional para proteger a la población. Asimismo, instamos al Gobierno a acelerar la implementación del Acuerdo de Paz, así como la implementación coordinada de las políticas de seguridad, paz total y desmantelamiento. Destacamos la reanudación del proceso de garantías para personas defensoras de derechos humanos y exhortamos a reformar el modelo de protección existente, incluyendo para personas defensoras del medio ambiente en particular riesgo. Asimismo, valoramos el proceso de transformación de la policía para fortalecer el respeto de los derechos humanos, incluyendo el derecho de reunión pacífica, la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas. En materia de justicia transicional, saludamos los avances, incluyendo las imputaciones recientes de crímenes de guerra y lesa humanidad por parte de la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz a excomandantes de la FARC-EP y a exmilitares del alto rango. Frente a la magnitud de las desapariciones forzadas en el marco del conflicto y de la persistencia de este crimen, destacamos también la importancia de la nueva ley sobre las mujeres buscadoras de víctimas de desaparición forzada. Esta ley establece un marco inédito en América Latina. Quisiera concluir reafirmando el compromiso de la oficina de seguir apoyando los esfuerzos encaminados a mejorar la situación de derechos humanos y construir una paz basada en los derechos humanos en Colombia. Señor presidente, sigo ahora con el informe sobre Guatemala, A/HRC/58/22. Reconocemos el compromiso del presidente Arévalo por impulsar un programa enmarcado en los derechos humanos, la igualdad y no discriminación, y la promoción de una agenda socioeconómica. Saludamos los varios diálogos del Estado con autoridades indígenas y afrodescendientes. Es importante institucionalizar estos espacios y cumplir con los acuerdos alcanzados, particularmente respecto al derecho a la consulta previa, libre e informada. Asimismo, tomamos nota de las acciones del gobierno para atender la conflictividad agraria y prevenir los desalojos forzosos. Reconocemos los avances del gobierno para la elaboración de la política pública de protección a personas defensoras de derechos humanos. Además, reconocemos los esfuerzos para promover los derechos de las personas con discapacidad. No obstante, el Alto Comisionado continúa preocupado por el uso indebido del derecho penal por parte de actores. Dentro del Ministerio Público y del organismo judicial, contra la defensa de derechos humanos y particularmente contra personas operadoras de justicia. Esta persecución penal, incluso por motivaciones políticas, también se ha dirigido contra funcionarios del actual gobierno y del Tribunal Supremo Electoral, con el propósito de cuestionar los resultados de las elecciones de 2023. El Alto Comisionado también nota con preocupación los serios retrasos en el acceso a la justicia con relación a graves violaciones de derechos humanos cometidas durante el conflicto armado interno, incluyendo la anulación de procesos y dilaciones indebidas, privando a las víctimas de sus derechos. Frente a estos retrasos y como parte de la justicia transicional, es importante avanzar con la iniciativa para un Plan Nacional de Dignificación y Reparación y un Plan Nacional de Búsqueda de Personas Desaparecidas. Urgen medidas eficaces para prevenir y erradicar la violencia contra mujeres y niñas, así como contra personas LGBTIQ+, y garantizar la atención a las víctimas. Reiteramos nuestro firme compromiso para apoyar los esfuerzos hacia la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos en Guatemala. Señor presidente, ahora paso al informe sobre la situación de derechos humanos en Honduras. A/HRC/58/23. En Honduras, la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos acoge con satisfacción las medidas clave para promover los derechos humanos, incluido el reconocimiento de las tierras ancestrales indígenas y la protección de los recursos naturales. Con la asistencia de la oficina, la adopción e implementación del proyecto de ley 18/2024, un hito histórico, condujo a la prohibición de la minería en áreas nacionales protegidas, a la suspensión de 3 concesiones mineras de alto impacto y al establecimiento de la Comisión Intersectorial de Alto Nivel. La Comisión ya comenzó a demarcar territorios ancestrales para cumplir con las sentencias internacionales en favor de comunidades garífunas. Sin embargo, persisten desafíos estructurales. Los conflictos vinculados a la tierra y el territorio continúan. Estos afectaron a comunidades rurales, pueblos indígenas y afrohondureños, principalmente en la región norte de Honduras. El Estado debe garantizar que la Comisión de la Verdad del Bajo Aguán funcione de manera efectiva para abordar las causas estructurales del conflicto agrario. El Sistema Nacional de Protección para Defensores de Derechos Humanos necesita ser fortalecido significativamente. Juan López, ambientalista y defensor del río Guapinol, fue asesinado en septiembre pasado en medio de constantes ataques, amenazas, intimidación y criminalización de las personas defensoras de derechos humanos por parte de diferentes actores. Los defensores de la tierra, el territorio y el medio ambiente siguen siendo los que corren mayor riesgo, representando del 47% de las víctimas. Para garantizar la independencia judicial es necesario realizar esfuerzos para mejorar las capacidades de coordinación en las investigaciones, reducir la estigmatización de las víctimas y mejorar la carrera de los operadores de justicia y los mecanismos de protección. En 2024, nuestra oficina siguió recibiendo denuncias de graves violaciones de derechos humanos durante el estado de excepción vigente, incluso 2 desapariciones forzadas y 7 ejecuciones extrajudiciales. El estado de emergencia encabezado por fuerzas militares sigue vigente en las cárceles, resultando en el uso desproporcionado de la fuerza en 3 incidentes importantes que dieron lugar a 3 presuntas ejecuciones extrajudiciales y 161 casos de malos tratos. Las políticas de seguridad deben priorizar la prevención y estar lideradas por instituciones civiles. La oficina mantiene su compromiso de apoyar a las autoridades para que adopten leyes y políticas que garanticen los derechos humanos de las mujeres, las niñas y las personas LGBTIQ, en consonancia con las obligaciones internacionales de Honduras en materia de derechos humanos. Señor presidente, paso ahora a la actualización oral sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en Nicaragua, de conformidad con la resolución 52/2 del Consejo de Derechos Humanos. El 30 de enero de 2025, la Asamblea Nacional adoptó de forma unánime la reforma constitucional. La nueva constitución nicaragüense otorga control total a la copresidencia sobre los órganos legislativo, judicial y electoral, desmantelando la separación de poderes. También restringe libertades fundamentales, debilita el debido proceso, elimina la prohibición explícita de la tortura. En el contexto de las próximas elecciones generales, instamos a Nicaragua a garantizar un proceso que asegure la participación política pluralista y elecciones libres y justas, en línea con los estándares internacionales de derechos humanos. En Nicaragua, detenciones arbitrarias afectan a opositores políticos, dirigentes indígenas, figuras religiosas y periodistas, creando un clima de miedo y silenciando toda voz independiente. Los malos tratos, la negación de atención médica y la alimentación insuficiente continúan siendo patrones preocupantes. Pedimos la liberación inmediata de todas las personas detenidas arbitrariamente y el fin de las desapariciones forzadas y los malos tratos. Los informes sobre represión contra la Iglesia Católica y otros grupos religiosos, incluidas confiscaciones de bienes, prohibiciones de entrada, expulsiones y restricciones a ceremonias religiosas, siguen suscitando graves preocupaciones sobre la libertad de religión en Nicaragua. Las denegaciones de entrada a Nicaragua han aumentado, con al menos de 15 casos desde enero. Esta práctica separa familias, restringe la libertad de movimiento, provoca la pérdida de medios de subsistencia y aumenta el riesgo de apatridia. Nos preocupa igualmente profundamente el continuo aislamiento de Nicaragua de la comunidad internacional. La reciente expulsión de la FAO y la falta de cooperación por la parte de Nicaragua con varios mecanismos de derechos humanos ilustran esta tendencia. Lamentamos también el reciente anuncio de Nicaragua de retirarse de este Consejo de Derechos Humanos y sus mecanismos. Reiteramos una vez más nuestro ofrecimiento de entablar un diálogo y de proporcionar capacitación en materia de derechos humanos a las autoridades nicaragüenses para que cumplan con sus obligaciones internacionales en materia de derechos humanos. Mr. President, I now turn to our report on Cyprus, A/HRC/58/21. The persisting division of Cyprus resulting from the Turkish intervention of 1974 continues to negatively impact the enjoyment of human rights for all people across the island. Last year witnessed the 60th anniversary since the establishment of UNFICYP and the mandate of the good offices of the Secretary General, and the 50th anniversary since the Turkish intervention of 1974. These anniversaries provide a stark reminder of the significant passage of time during which the people of Cyprus have been waiting for a just and durable solution to the island's continued division, which would facilitate the full realization of their human rights. Persisting challenges to the right to non-discrimination and the enjoyment of economic, social, and cultural rights, especially for Turkish Cypriots, Greek Cypriots, and Maronites living in the north, continue to hinder social cohesion and inter-community trust building. While the Republic of Cyprus adopted 14 measures in January last year to address issues impacting Turkish Cypriot daily life, the full and effective implementation of those measures and additional targeted measures are needed to address these challenges and promote inclusivity. With each passing year, it's becoming increasingly imperative to enlarge existing crossing points and to establish a new crossing point to facilitate the right to freedom of movement. This would help promote intercommunal contacts and trust building, which are essential foundations for advancing efforts to resolve the island's ongoing division. While it is welcome that the Technical Committee on Education resumed its regular meetings, urgent actions are needed to develop and improve relevant educational material and effectively train teachers to advance peace education for all. Peace education for every child holds the potential to transform Cypriot society and advance social cohesion. In the face of these challenges, it is heartening to learn of a bicommunal civil society initiative to address human rights violations affecting both the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities. We urge all parties to ensure that a human rights-based approach underpins their mutual dialogue and cooperation, with a view to upholding the human rights for all people in Cyprus. Mr. President, finally, I turn to Sri Lanka in implementation of HRC Resolution 57/1. Following presidential and parliamentary elections late last year, the National People's Power Coalition secured a large majority in parliament, signaling a decisive mandate from the Sri Lankan people to undertake transformative social, political, and economic reforms. Economic crisis and austerity measures have impacted deeply on the poorest and most vulnerable in society. Creditors need to provide the government with the fiscal space necessary to realize all human rights. In his inaugural address to Parliament, President Kumara Dissanayake acknowledged the harms that have resulted from decades of ethnic divisions and racism. He pledged to address some long-standing human rights concerns, including by tackling corruption and ensuring accountability for the 2019 Easter Sunday attacks and other emblematic cases. These commitments to end impunity should extend to the large-scale violations that occurred during the civil war and prior insurgencies. These crimes must be thoroughly investigated, justice served to victims, and perpetrators held accountable. The new government has taken an initial step to appoint an expert panel to establish an independent prosecutor's office. We also urge the new government to reform and strengthen the Office of Missing Persons, including by appointing independent and credible members to achieve meaningful progress in the thousands of cases of enforced disappearances. The government is taking steps to amend problematic legislation, such as the Oppressive Prevention of Terrorism Act and the Online Safety Act. All new laws must comply with Sri Lanka's international human rights obligations and be developed in a transparent, consultative, and inclusive manner. Our office continues to receive reports of surveillance and intimidation by security agents in the north and east, highlighting the need for more fundamental security sector reforms. We urge the new government to lift unnecessary regulation and restriction on civil society and independent media to revive the civic space. This is an important opportunity in Sri Lanka's history that must now translate into meaningful progress on accountability and human rights to heal societal divisions and break the cycle of impunity that has for so long racked Sri Lanka's past. Our office is ready to support Sri Lanka and hopes it can report tangible results to this Council in September. I thank you.
Je vous remercie. Conformément à notre pratique, nous commencerons par entendre les délégations des pays concernés par les rapports et les mises à jour orales présentées. Chaque délégation disposera de 5 minutes et je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Colombie.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco al alto comisionado su informe que nos muestra falencias existentes y frentes principales a los que debemos prestar atención. Le agradezco también los reconocimientos de aciertos que hemos tenido. Hace décadas padecemos una crisis de derechos humanos en medio de conflictos armados internos que decidimos superar apoyados en el Acuerdo de Paz de 2016 y en una política de paz total basada en derechos humanos. Nuestros esfuerzos se orientan en 3 direcciones: proscribir violaciones estatales, liberar a nuestro país de conflictos armados y restablecer derechos de las víctimas de violaciones. En el primer empeño hemos avanzado. Su informe verificó en 2024 18 denuncias de privación arbitraria de libertad por la fuerza pública, una reducción del 39% frente a 2023. Han sido valiosos los aportes de su oficina a la doctrina operativa de la policía sobre uso de fuerza y gestión de protestas, plasmados en el decreto 1231. Pese a ello, el pasado viernes la Unidad de Diálogo y Mantenimiento del Orden hirió a 4 estudiantes menores de edad en Barrancabermeja, reprochable e inadmisible. En igual dirección se avanza para cumplir una sentencia sobre violencia contra personas defensoras y adoptar con las plataformas de derechos humanos una política nacional de garantías y el plan de acción para mujeres defensoras, al igual que una red del Ministerio de Medio Ambiente a favor de ambientalistas y del campesinado. En el segundo empeño, 9 procesos de diálogo con actores armados no han implicado todavía desarme, pero sí reducción de índices de violencia. Aunque continúan siendo altos, muestran un descenso comparados con los de 2023, como el asesinato de defensores, 15%, o de desmovilizados de las FARC, 31%, masacres, 27%, desplazamiento forzado, 18%. Estamos lejos de cantar victoria. Mientras que en 2024 las personas desplazadas fueron 48.000, en los 2 primeros meses de 2025 han sido desplazadas en el Catatumbo más de 52.000 personas. Superar la violencia en Colombia requiere redoblar esfuerzos nacionales y apoyo internacional que agradecemos. En el tercer empeño, su informe celebra nuestro nuevo enfoque sobre drogas, centrado en la asfixia de las actividades criminales y el oxígeno para los derechos de personas cultivadoras y la atención en salud a los consumidores. En esa dirección se inscribe en la aprobación de la Convención sobre Derechos del Campesinado y de la Jurisdicción Agraria y los avances en la reforma rural, entre otros. Mención especial merece el diálogo en el norte del Cauca entre comunidades étnicas, campesinas e industriales de la caña sobre propiedad y uso de la tierra, respeto de los derechos humanos y agenda de desarrollo sostenible, realizado con apoyo de su oficina en Colombia. Pese a estos esfuerzos, la violencia de grupos irregulares persiste en Colombia y afecta mucho a comunidades étnicas y campesinas, mujeres, niñas y niños, víctimas de reclutamiento y otras violaciones, adultos mayores, comunidad LGBTIQ+, personas defensoras y líderes sociales, población pobre, personas desplazadas y confinadas. Solo garantizando sus derechos podremos consolidar una paz duradera. Entre estos sectores vulnerables, permítame mencionar a los migrantes y señalar la importancia de exigir respeto por sus derechos. Como dice el Papa Francisco en su reciente carta a los obispos estadounidenses, y cito, el acto de deportar personas que en muchos casos han dejado su propia tierra por motivos de pobreza extrema, de inseguridad, de explotación, de persecución o por el grave deterioro del medio ambiente, lastima la dignidad de muchos hombres y mujeres, de familias enteras y los coloca en un estado de especial vulnerabilidad e indefensión. Hasta aquí la cita, y agrega el Papa, un auténtico Estado de Derecho se verifica precisamente en el trato digno, que merecen todas las personas, en especial los más pobres y marginados. Hasta aquí la cita. En migración, cambio climático o cualquier otra materia, nuestro gobierno ha situado la dignidad humana y los derechos humanos como eje transversal y por ello hemos adoptado un enfoque de seguridad humana. Para hacerlo realidad, el gobierno ha nombrado ministro de Defensa al general retirado Pedro Sánchez, quien comandó el rescate de los niños perdidos en el Amazonas en 2023 y puso ejemplarmente las armas de la República al servicio de una comunidad indígena. Esperamos que bajo la dirección civil de este general retirado, nuestras fuerzas militares superen la estigmatización de sectores de la población vistos equivocadamente como enemigos internos, según la doctrina de seguridad nacional en la que fueron formados, o más exactamente deformados, algunos de ellos. Señora directora, señor presidente, deme 10 segundos más. Colombia seguirá encarando los retos en derechos humanos con colaboración y apertura. Por ello, acogemos con gratitud la radiografía de nuestra situación contenida en las observaciones de su informe y asumimos con seriedad las sabias prescripciones para su superación, que no son otras que las recomendaciones allí formuladas. Muchísimas gracias.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Chypre.
Thank you, Mr. President. Cyprus appreciates the presentation of this year's report on the question of human rights in Cyprus and thanks the High Commissioner and the Office for their continued engagement. Mr. President, I have heard the High Commissioner speaking keenly about the need to further enhance the impact of the work of the Office as well as of the Human Rights Council, and this could not ring truer when it comes to the report on Cyprus. For several years now, the report has been gradually straying from its core mandate and contains methodological deficiencies. Rather than providing original evidence-based analysis, it largely compiles information from a compendium of sources that lack a human rights perspective. It continues to create a false equivalence between the Republic of Cyprus and a secessionist entity. Human rights violations that have persisted for more than half a century, arising from Turkey's invasion and ongoing occupation, are documented as events that have no agent and no cause, effectively eliminating accountability. From our perspective, enhancing the report's impact would require a sharper focus on the specific mandates established by the Commission of Human Rights resolution immediately following the 1974 invasion by Turkey and reinforced in subsequent resolutions. It would also require recalibrating the report to capture the cumulative impact of these ongoing violations and to reinforce the message that the passage of time neither erases these violations nor does it grant aggressors impunity. These mandates specifically call for the full restoration of all human rights to the population of Cyprus, in particular to the refugees, including the freedom of settlement and the right to property, the tracing and accounting of the missing persons in Cyprus, the cessation of any efforts to settle Varasha by people other than its legal inhabitants, and the refraining from actions that alter the demographic structure of Cyprus. We would like to see, for example, that the report includes a substantive section on the demographic alterations resulting from Turkey's deliberate settlement policy, as explicitly mandated in Resolution 432 of 1976. This topic is entirely absent in the resolution's current and several past iterations. Regarding missing persons, we would expect the report to move beyond descriptive accounts. We would like to see the incorporation of a rights-based analysis that applies established European Court of Human Rights jurisprudence concerning Turkey's legal obligations. We acknowledge the High Commissioner's engagement with this year's report, which resulted to an extended field visit by the Office to Cyprus. Despite our critiques, Cyprus remains committed to working closely with the High Commissioner and his office with a view to enhancing the report's methodology and impact. This includes strengthening the use of evidence-based methods and tools to ensure greater accuracy and effectiveness. Ultimately, documenting human rights violations is crucial for sustainable conflict resolution. We firmly believe that the documentation of human rights violations and ensuring accountability are not peripheral concerns, but essential pillars for fostering reconciliation and achieving a sustainable resolution to the Cyprus question. An improved and more impactful report could be one of several significant components that could inform and support efforts towards addressing the Cyprus question comprehensively, achieving a just and durable solution. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente, por darme la palabra. El gobierno de Guatemala agradece al alto comisionado por su informe anual y se compromete a seguir trabajando para la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Consideramos que presenta un diagnóstico que refleja la realidad nacional, coincidiendo con las prioridades de la administración del presidente Bernardo Arévalo de León y que responden a las necesidades de nuestra sociedad. Reconocemos el apoyo que la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para los Derechos Humanos ha brindado a nuestro país desde el 2005, cuando fue establecida. Su compromiso constante ha sido crucial para el fortalecimiento de las capacidades institucionales y la consolidación de visiones respetuosas de los derechos humanos. Durante la visita del Alto Comisionado en julio de 2024, le reiteramos nuestro compromiso con la defensa de la democracia, la consolidación del Estado de Derecho y la plena vigencia de los derechos humanos, refrendando la voluntad del gobierno de abrir nuevamente el país a los mecanismos de supervisión del sistema multilateral en materia de derechos humanos. La configuración histórica de Guatemala dejó de garantizar los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, mujeres, niños y migrantes, generando exclusión y marginación social, racismo y discriminación racial. Buscamos garantizar el respeto, promoción de la seguridad mediante la creación de condiciones que permitan a las personas su desarrollo personal, familiar y social en paz, libertad y democracia. Creemos que se debe asegurar sistemas de protección de carácter universal que promuevan la presencia del Estado. Reconocemos la diversidad étnica y cultural del país y la necesidad de respetar los derechos colectivos de los pueblos indígenas mediante el fortalecimiento de la educación intercultural bilingüe, así como garantizar el acceso a la justicia en idiomas indígenas. Al mismo tiempo, reiteramos nuestro compromiso para avanzar hacia un futuro donde la violencia de género sea erradicada y la igualdad de oportunidades sea la norma. La eliminación de todas las formas de violencia contra las mujeres y otros grupos vulnerables es un objetivo prioritario del gobierno guatemalteco, que estamos persiguiendo con una urgencia y determinación. Señor presidente, rechazamos categóricamente el uso indebido del sistema penal por actores estatales y no estatales para obstaculizar el trabajo de periodistas, defensores de derechos humanos y operadores de justicia. Condenamos esta práctica que intimida y castiga a quienes ejercen derechos fundamentales como la libertad de expresión, asociación y reunión. Hemos avanzado en el proceso de aprobación de la política pública para personas defensoras de derechos humanos en Guatemala 2025-2035, creando mecanismos de prevención de riesgo y amenazas en su contra, implementando un sistema de protección integral y promoviendo la coordinación interinstitucional para garantizar el acceso a la justicia y reparación digna. Reconocemos que la corrupción ha afectado la gobernabilidad, generando profundas desigualdades sociales. Estamos impulsando acciones enfocadas en el fortalecimiento de la institucionalidad, la rendición de cuentas y el incremento de la transparencia mediante mecanismos de gobierno abierto y gobierno electrónico. Nos complace haber subido 2 puntos del 23 al 25 en el índice de percepción de corrupción del 2024, que es elaborado por Transparencia Internacional. La Comisión Presidencial por la Paz y los Derechos Humanos, COPADE, con la asesoría técnica de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado, llevará a cabo un proceso de recopilación de información y definición de prioridades para la elaboración de una hoja de ruta nacional sobre empresas y derechos humanos. Este instrumento incluirá un estudio diagnóstico que permitirá evaluar el nivel de implementación de los principios rectores de las Naciones Unidas sobre las empresas y los derechos humanos e identificar los principales ejes de trabajo con diversos sectores para fortalecer su cumplimiento. Señor presidente, tomamos nota de las importantes conclusiones y recomendaciones contenidas en el informe y valoramos que se reconozca el gobierno del presidente Bernardo Arévalo tiene un compromiso y una agenda en favor de los derechos humanos. Reiteramos nuestro compromiso con la protección de los derechos humanos y su voluntad de seguir trabajando para construir una sociedad más justa e igualitaria. Por ello, continuaremos impulsando espacios de diálogo nacional con el objetivo de aunar prioridades y puntos de consenso que servirán para consolidar una agenda nacional de desarrollo. Muchas gracias.
Merci. Je donne la parole à la distinguée représentante du Honduras, Madame Angélica Lizeth Álvarez, secrétaire d'État aux droits de l'homme, par vidéo.
Señor presidente, Honduras recibe con agrado el informe anual presentado por el Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos respecto a la situación de los derechos humanos en nuestro país. Agradecemos su ardua labor, cooperación y asistencia técnica, la cual ha sido fundamental para fortalecer las capacidades nacionales en la implementación de políticas que garanticen los derechos humanos. Particularmente destacamos el apoyo de la oficina en lo referido a la consolidación de un marco normativo en sintonía con los estándares internacionales en materia de derechos humanos y en la promoción del espacio cívico a través del diálogo constante entre autoridades, sociedad civil y otros actores relevantes. Con la firme voluntad política del gobierno de Honduras se han logrado avances significativos en la esfera de los derechos humanos. Estos avances se centran especialmente en el fortalecimiento del Estado constitucional de derecho, en la reducción de la desigualdad social y económica como una prioridad de nuestro gobierno. A lo largo del año 2024 y hasta la fecha se han alcanzado hitos históricos en diversos ámbitos, reflejando el compromiso del Estado con el fortalecimiento institucional, la transparencia y la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos, con especial énfasis en la protección de los grupos más vulnerables, como las personas migrantes, privados de libertad, defensores de derechos humanos y otros, los cuales expongo de la siguiente manera. Se incrementó el presupuesto para el año fiscal 2025 del Comisionado Nacional de los Derechos Humanos en un 38.27% en comparación al presupuesto de 2022. El crecimiento económico del 4%, siendo de los más altos en Centroamérica, y un aumento histórico del 34.2% del presupuesto para la inversión pública. Inició la construcción de 8 nuevos hospitales con el objetivo principal de mejorar el acceso de la salud de toda la población en las distintas regiones del país. La reducción del 9% en la tasa de homicidios, disminuyendo de 34.4 homicidios por cada 100,000 habitantes en 2023 a 25.3 en 2024. Emisión de sentencias condenatorias en casos emblemáticos de violaciones a derechos humanos, el caso del fraude sobre el Hualcarque, que involucró a exfuncionarios y personal de la empresa del proyecto hidroeléctrico Agua Zarca. Relacionado al caso Berta Cáceres, la declaración de inconstitucionalidad a las reformas a los artículos constitucionales, como el decreto que contenía la ley orgánica de las zonas de empleo y desarrollo económico, mejor conocida como las sedes. La emisión del decreto legislativo 18/2024 en relación al desmantelamiento del proyecto minero en el Parque Nacional Montaña Botaderos Carlos Escaleras Mejía. La aprobación del Acuerdo Ejecutivo 14/2024 que crea la Estrategia Nacional de Restauración Forestal 2023-2030, la creación de una jurisdicción especial sobre tierras y territorio para abordar conflictos socioambientales, priorizando un enfoque de derechos humanos sobre un enfoque punitivo. La aprobación del Acuerdo Ejecutivo 004/2024 que autoriza a la Secretaría de Estado en el Despacho de Derechos Humanos para realizar compras y contrataciones directas para agilizar los procesos de mejora al funcionamiento del Sistema Nacional de Protección. La promoción de una ley para reformar los tipos penales y normas procesales utilizados frecuentemente para criminalizar a personas defensoras de derechos humanos. La aprobación de la ley Casa Refugio para víctimas de violencia de género y la aprobación del Acuerdo Ejecutivo 002/2024 que modificó la norma técnica para el manejo de la sangre y los componentes sanguíneos de 1999 que excluía en forma permanente la donación de sangre a personas homosexuales y bisexuales. Por lo antes expuesto, el Estado de Honduras reafirma su apertura al diálogo constructivo y a la cooperación internacional como pilares fundamentales para el fortalecimiento de los derechos humanos en el país. En este marco, reconoce nuevamente el rol de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos y su contribución en el acompañamiento técnico y el intercambio de buenas prácticas. Finalmente, con una visión orientada hacia el futuro y con la firme voluntad del actual gobierno, Honduras continuará promoviendo iniciativas que fortalezcan un entorno de respeto y plena garantía de los derechos humanos en estricto cumplimiento de sus compromisos tanto nacionales como internacionales. Muchas gracias.
Merci. Je constate que la délégation de Nicaragua n'est pas présente dans la salle et je donne donc la parole à la distinguée représentante du Sri Lanka.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, pursuant to a free, fair and peaceful election in keeping with our decades of democratic practice, President Anurukumara Dissanayake was sworn in as the Executive President of Sri Lanka in September last year, followed by the election of a new parliament in November, enabling the government to move forward with a strengthened mandate. The Minister of Foreign Affairs, in his address to this council last week, highlighted that Sri Lanka has embarked on a new path with a government built through the collective will of the people from the north, east, west, and south of the country. He highlighted the government's commitment towards a unified Sri Lankan nation that respects diversity and works towards removing all divisions. The government has prioritized economic growth, which is inclusive, where all citizens have enhanced economic opportunities. The rule of law, transparency, accountability, and reconciliation will prevail in order to ensure sustained economic growth and social well-being of the people. The government has committed to protect democracy and human rights of all citizens, including addressing past issues, ensure the related domestic processes to be credible and independent within the constitutional framework, and to examine carefully and expand the work of the proposed Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate acts of violence caused by racism and religious extremism. Economic priorities of the government include eradicating rural poverty, implementing the Clean Sri Lanka initiative to promote social, environmental, and ethical revival, and establishing a robust digital economy to foster innovation and sustainable growth. The government is committed to ensuring assistance to all citizens affected by the conflict in consonance with its pledge to achieve sustainable peace, reconciliation, and development in the conflict-affected areas. Mr. President, the work of the Office on Missing Persons continues with enhanced public trust and functional and financial independence. The OMP is collaborating with national, bilateral, and international partners, including the ICRC and UN agencies, as well as local CSOs. Through a national-level steering committee, the OMP is working with government agencies and has a separate national CSO forum functioning at national as well as district level under government agents. The work of the Office for Reparations goes beyond monetary compensation to include livelihood and psychosocial support as collective reparation initiatives. The OR functions as an effective remedy to contribute to the promotion of reconciliation and for the well-being and security of all Sri Lankans. Following its establishment as an independent institution through an Act of Parliament in 2024, the Office for National Unity and Reconciliation has been further strengthened and conducts training programs to promote social cohesion, religious coexistence, and conflict transformation workshops, providing opportunities for interfaith and intercultural dialogue, particularly among the youth. Reconciliation committees at grassroots level comprising clergy, women's groups, youth groups, government officials, and civil society leaders are involved in these activities. Mr. President, national ownership with gradual reforms is the only practical way forward to transformative change. We regret the continuing inconsistent application of human rights principles through the work of the Council that has resulted in the erosion of trust in the human rights architecture, making countries less likely to respect the noble purposes for which the Human Rights Council was created. Sri Lanka has consistently spoken out against country-specific resolutions that do not have the concurrence of the country concerned. We have reiterated our rejection of resolutions 46/1, 51/1, and 57/1, and the external evidence gathering mechanism on Sri Lanka that has been set up using these divisive and intrusive resolutions. The external evidence gathering mechanism on Sri Lanka contradicts the Council's founding principles of impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. No sovereign country can accept the superimposition of an external mechanism that runs contrary to its constitution and which prejudges the commitment of its domestic legal processes. Serious concerns have been raised by a number of countries on the budgetary implications of this external mechanism. Sri Lanka is determined to deal with human rights challenges through domestic processes and will continue its constructive engagement with the Human Rights Council and regular human rights instruments in a spirit of cooperation and constructive dialogue. Sri Lanka reiterates its commitment to multilateral cooperation in pursuit of peace, prosperity, and sustainability, along with the promotion and protection of all human rights. Thank you.
Merci. Excellences, distingués collègues, nous allons maintenant entamer le débat général sur le point 2 de l'agenda. Avant de commencer, je voudrais vous rappeler que toutes les demandes de droit de réponse relatives à des déclarations faites au cours du débat général seront traitées à la fin de celui-ci. Je rappelle également à tous les orateurs qu'ils doivent respecter le temps de parole qui leur est imparti, à savoir 2 minutes et 30 secondes pour les membres et 1 minute et 30 secondes pour les observateurs. Je vous remercie de votre compréhension et de votre coopération. Nous allons maintenant commencer par la liste des membres du Conseil. La liste des orateurs sera close dans 15 minutes et je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Jordanie au nom du groupe des pays arabes.
شكرا السيد الرئيس. تؤكد المجموعة العربية على أهمية العمل الذي يقوم به المفوض السامي في سبيل حماية وتعزيز حقوق الإنسان. وتحث المجموعة المفوض السامي على تناول قضايا حقوق الإنسان في جميع الدول على قدم المساواة وفي إطار من الحيادية والموضوعية، أخذا في الاعتبار ما كشفه العدوان الإسرائيلي من ازدواجية المعايير الصارخة التي يتعامل بها المجتمع الدولي مع الأزمات العالمية. من هذا المنطلق تدعو المجموعة العربية المجتمع الدولي بتحمل مسؤولياته إزاء ضمان تنفيذ وقف إطلاق النار بما يضمن تمتع الشعب الفلسطيني بحقوقه غير القابلة للتصرف وعلى رأسها حقه في تقرير مصيره وفي العودة إلى أرضه، فضلا عن دعم الاعتراف بدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة وإنهاء الاحتلال الإسرائيلي غير المشروع لأراضيه. كما تؤكد المجموعة رفضها أي محاولات تستهدف تصفية القضية الفلسطينية من خلال انتزاع الشعب الفلسطيني أو تهجيره من أرضه التاريخية في انتهاك صارخ للقانون الدولي. فيما يتعلق بالسودان، تؤكد المجموعة ضرورة الحفاظ على سيادة السودان ووحدة وسلامة أراضيه وصون حق الشعب السوداني في الحياة الكريمة والأمن والتنمية. كما تعرب المجموعة عن قلقها البالغ إزاء استمرار الحوادث الخاصة بحرق القرآن الكريم وتصاعد حوادث الكراهية التي تشكل تحريضا على التمييز والعنف ضد العرب والمسلمين واللاجئين والمهاجرين في عدد من الدول. وتدعو المفوض السامي إلى دانة أي أفعال تؤجج مشاعر الكراهية، وتدعو حكومات الدول المعنية لسن تشريعات رادعة بما يفي بالتزاماتها في مجال حقوق الإنسان. كما نحثه على إيلاء المزيد من الاهتمام بأزمة المياه العالمية وأثرها على التمتع بجميع حقوق الإنسان، والاستمرار في الجهد الجاري لتسليط الضوء على الحقوق الاقتصادية والاجتماعية والثقافية. وتؤكد المجموعة العربية على أهمية عناية تقارير المكتب المفوض باحترام الخلفيات الثقافية والدينية المختلفة للدول والشعوب والاستفادة من التنوع الحضاري والثقافي حول العالم كقوة محركة للتنمية المستدامة. كما تشدد على أهمية تعزيز برامج التعاون الفني وبناء القدرات باعتبارها الوسيلة الأكثر استدامة لتعزيز حقوق الإنسان في الدول المختلفة. شكرا.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to speak on behalf of 25 countries which are member states of the European Union. We refer to the EU statements during the interactive dialogues on Eritrea, Sudan, South Sudan, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, and Myanmar, as well as the occupied Palestinian territory. 3 years since Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we continue to condemn the atrocities committed in Ukraine. Russia must cease its aggression, withdraw its forces, and fully respect Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. We support Ukraine in achieving comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in line with international law and the UN Charter. We remain concerned about the significant restrictions of fundamental freedoms, the shrinking civic space, and the use of death penalty in several countries in the MENA region. And with regard to the situation in Yemen, we emphasize the need for continued independent human rights monitoring. We condemn the arbitrary detentions of UN and diplomatic staff. We encourage Bahrain to further align its policies with international human rights law, especially with regard to the human rights defenders. In Ethiopia, we continue to be concerned about reports of human rights violations and continued shrinking civic space. We look forward to the implementation of the transitional justice policy. We remain concerned about the disregard of human rights by the Venezuelan authorities and condemn the acts of repression against dissenting voices. The authorities must unconditionally release all political prisoners, including dual and foreign citizens. We welcome the return of OHCHR and stress the need for access. We remain concerned about the instrumentalization of the justice system in Guatemala and welcome the efforts to advance good governance, transparency, inclusion, and the protection of human rights. We call on Vietnam to ensure that civil society can participate in all aspects of development, free of harassment, intimidations, and reprisals. We closely follow the human rights situation in Azerbaijan and call for the release of all those imprisoned for exercising their human rights and fundamental freedoms. And lastly, we reaffirm our support to the International Criminal Court, as well as our commitment to upholding the Rome Statute and preserving the ICC's independence and integrity. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. This statement is by the Sri Lanka Core Group, comprising Canada, Malawi, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and the United Kingdom. High Commissioner, we wish to thank you for your oral update on Sri Lanka. We would like to commend Sri Lanka's peaceful elections and the smooth transition of power last year. We recognise that the new Sri Lankan government has only been in place for 4 months, and we encourage Sri Lanka to use the opportunity that this transition represents to address the challenges it faces. We appreciate the government's commitment to making meaningful progress on reconciliation and the initial steps taken, including returning land, lifting roadblocks, and allowing communities in the north and east to commemorate the past and to memorialise their loved ones. In order to build and sustain trust, it is essential to ensure the protection of civil society spaces, including by ending surveillance and intimidation of civil society actors and organisations. We welcome commitments to implement devolution in accordance with the Constitution and to make progress on governance reforms. We take note of the government's stated intention to replace the Prevention of Terrorism Act and emphasise that any new legislation should be in line with Sri Lanka's international obligations. We encourage the release of those who remain detained under the Act. As the government seeks to make progress on human rights and corruption cases, we urge that any comprehensive reconciliation and accountability process carry the support of affected communities, build on past recommendations, and meet international standards. We also encourage the government to reinvigorate the work of domestic institutions focused on reparations and missing persons. We reaffirm our willingness to work with the government to ensure that any future transitional justice mechanisms are independent, inclusive, meaningful, and meet the expectations of affected communities. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela tiene el honor de tomar la palabra en nombre del Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de la ONU. El Grupo de Amigos concede un valor supremo a la promoción y protección de todos los derechos humanos tanto individuales como colectivos, sin distinción de niveles o categorías, y considera que su promoción y protección se refuerzan sobre la base del diálogo y la cooperación, de conformidad con los principios de imparcialidad, objetividad, transparencia, no selectividad, no politización y no confrontación. Es de suma importancia que los esfuerzos se lleven a cabo no solo de manera responsable, sino que no atenten contra los valores y principios fundamentales antes referidos, a fin de evitar que sea instrumentalizada la institución de los derechos humanos para atentar contra la soberanía de los estados o para interferir en los asuntos internos de los mismos. En consecuencia, aprovechamos esta oportunidad para reiterar nuestro categórico rechazo al doble rasero en el ámbito de los derechos humanos, ya que tal enfoque impide un entorno armonioso y el progreso en este campo. También expresamos nuestra grave preocupación por la continua y creciente proliferación de mecanismos y procedimientos que pretenden realizar evaluaciones supuestamente imparciales de la situación de los derechos humanos en estados concretos. En la mayoría de los casos carecen del debido consentimiento y participación del estado afectado. Se basan en fuentes de carácter secundario, terciario o de otro tipo que pueden estar sesgadas o carecer de credibilidad y responden a agendas políticas de dudosa naturaleza. En ese contexto, cabe señalar que en ciertos casos, algunas evaluaciones de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado han ido incluso mucho más allá de su mandato. Para concluir, el grupo de amigos insiste en que no debe haber otra opción que el diálogo y la cooperación para fortalecer los derechos humanos, tanto a nivel nacional como internacional. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Thailand.
Thank you, Mr. President. I am pleased to make this statement on behalf of Colombia, Cyprus, Chechnya, the Gambia, Iceland, Marshall Islands, Mexico, Republic of Korea, Spain, Switzerland, North Macedonia, and my own country, Thailand. As incoming members of the Human Rights Council, we are committed to the success and effectiveness of the Council and are convinced that the Council plays an invaluable role in promoting and protecting human rights worldwide. In establishing this council over 10 years ago, it was made clear that council members shall uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and fully cooperate with the council. In furtherance of these requirements, we commit to strengthening the council and pledge to 1. Cooperate in good faith with the OHCHR, the council and its mechanisms, including responding in a timely manner to their communications and country visit requests. 2. Address human rights concerns on their merits, applying objective and human rights-based criteria in determining whether and how the Council should respond to a situation of concern, and take leadership and responsibility in initiating action when such criteria are met. 3. Engage with the Council in a spirit of self-reflection with a view to improving our own human rights situation, recognizing that no state has a perfect human rights record. 4. Engage in the work of the Council in good faith and in a transparent manner, including in resolution negotiations. 5. Avoid procedural tactics when used to block genuine debate and prevent the Council from considering human rights issues on their merits. 6. Work to fulfill the Council's prevention mandate through both technical assistance and capacity building, as well as receiving the High Commissioner's early warning information and taking early preventive action. 7. Plan to make progress in the full realization of human rights at the national level, including through implementation of recommendations and resolutions of the Council and its mechanism. And 8. Work in cooperation with civil society in relation to our engagement with the Council, support their participation, strive to create a safe and enabling environment for them, and prevent and address acts of intimidation and reprisals. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uganda on behalf of the movement of non-aligned countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the non-aligned movement in NAM. NAM emphasizes the need for constructive engagement with UN member states on both bilateral and multilateral human rights issues and appreciates OHCR efforts in advancing human rights at the global level. We are concerned about severe acts of multiple forms of discrimination in many regions, widespread violations of economic and social rights, and attacks motivated by stereotypes and hatred of many kinds. Therefore, the expectations of the UN member states from the work of the High Commissioner and his office are higher than ever. We implore the Office of the High Commissioner, in line with General Assembly Resolution 48-141, to strictly uphold in its activities the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to respect sovereignty, territorial integrity, and domestic jurisdiction of states, and emphasize the universality and indivisibility of human rights. Furthermore, the NAM reaffirms its position on the need to respect the right of all those to choose values and principles appropriate to their people for the protection and promotion of human rights, and the rejection of attempts to impose their values and cultures under the pretext of the universality of human rights. We welcome the ceasefire in Gaza and emphasize the need to sustain it to enable lasting peace and stability in the state of Palestine. In the same vein, we call for all necessary support towards reconstruction of the destroyed infrastructure in Gaza. We reject any proposal to forcibly displace or relocate the people of Palestine, as it is tantamount to ethnic cleansing contrary to international law, including international human rights law and international humanitarian law. We re-emphasize the call upon all states and this council to respect the ICJ's advisory opinion in Israel's illegal occupation of Palestine. The NAM recognizes the importance of the role of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in addressing the challenges arising from unilateral coercive measures and their negative impact on the human rights of peoples and individuals who wish to realize their economic and social rights, including the right to development. Finally, the movement reaffirms its commitment to constructively work with the Office of the High Commissioner to strengthen the credibility of the human rights mechanisms and to build an international order based on inclusion, mutual understanding, and respect for cultural diversity. I thank you.
Thank you. I want to inform you that the speakers list is now closed, and I give the floor to Yemen on behalf of a group of countries by video.
السيد الرئيس، أتشرف بأن أدلي بهذا البيان نيابة عن مجموعة من 39 دولة تدعم السيادة الكاملة للمملكة المغربية على أقاليمها الجنوبية، وترحب المجموعة بافتتاح العديد من الدول القنصليات عامة لها في مدينتي الداخلة والعيون كرافعة لتعزيز التعاون الاقتصادي والاستثمارات لصالح السكان المحليين وتعزيزا للتنمية الإقليمية وكذلك الغارية، فإنها تعتبر أن قضية الصحراء نزاع سياسي يعالج من قبل مجلس الأمن الذي يعترف بأولوية مبادرة الحكم الذاتي الذي قدمها المغرب باعتبارها جادة وذات مصداقية ومن أجل التوصل لحل سياسي نهائي للنزاع الإقليمي حول الصحراء. ومن هذا المنظور تدعم المجموعة الجهود الرامية إلى إعادة إطلاق العملية السياسية الحصرية للأمم المتحدة على أساس الصيغة التي تم تحديدها خلال الموائد المستديرة المنعقدة في جنيف، وذلك وفقا لقرارات مجلس الأمن التي ترمي إلى تحقيق حل سياسي وواقعي وعملي ودائم لهذا النزاع الإقليمي مبني على التوافق. إن حل هذا الخلاف الإقليمي سيستلزم لا محالة في تحقيق التطلعات المشروعة للشعوب الأفريقية والعربية في التكامل والتنمية، وهو الهدف الذي يواصل المغرب السعي من أجله ويبذل جهودا مخلصة ومتواصلة لبلوغه. لقد انخرط المغرب منذ سنوات عديدة في تفاعل
Ambassador, we were not able to translate it because the sound quality of the video is very bad. I don't see you right now, but I saw you in the meeting room before. Are you ready to read the statement in the room? Microphone for Yemen, please. Yes.
السيد الرئيس، أتشرف بأن أدلي بهذا البيان نيابة عن مجموعة من 39 دولة تدعم السيادة الكاملة للمملكة المغربية على أقاليمها الجنوبية، وترحب المجموعة بافتتاح العديد من الدول لقنصليات عامة لها في مدينتي الداخلة والعيون كرافعة لتعزيز التعاون الاقتصادي والاستثمارات لصالح السكان المحليين وتعزيز للتنمية الإقليمية وكذلك القارية، فإنها تعتبر أن قضية الصحراء نزاع سياسي يعالج من قبل مجلس الأمن الذي يعترف بأولوية مبادرة الحكم الذاتي التي قدمها المغرب باعتبارها جادة وذات مصداقية من أجل التوصل لحل سياسي نهائي للنزاع الإقليمي حول الصحراء. ومن هذا المنظور تدعم المجموعة الجهود الرامية إلى إعادة إطلاق العملية السياسية الحصرية للأمم المتحدة على أساس الصيغة التي تم تحديدها من خلال الموائد المستديرة المنعقدة في جنيف، وذلك وفقا لقرارات مجلس الأمن التي ترمي إلى تحقيق حل سياسي واقعي وعملي ودائم لهذا النزاع الإقليمي مبني على التوافق. إن حل هذا الخلاف الإقليمي سيسهم لا محالة في تحقيق التطلعات المشروعة للشعوب الأفريقية والعربية في التكامل والتنمية، وهو الهدف الذي يواصل المغرب السعي من أجله ويبذل جهودا مخلصة ومتواصلة لبلوغه. لقد انخرط المغرب منذ سنوات عديدة في تفاعل بناء طوعي وعميق مع منظومة الأمم المتحدة لحقوق الإنسان، ولا سيما مكتب المفوض السامي لحقوق الإنسان، من أجل تعزيز حقوق الإنسان واحترامها في جميع أنحاء التراب الوطني للمملكة. ويذكر في هذا السياق ترحيب مجلس الأمن في قراراته بشأن نزاع الصحراء بالدور الذي تلعبه اللجنتين القهويتين للمجلس الوطني لحقوق الإنسان في الداخل والعيون، وكذا بالتفاعل الإيجابي للمغرب مع آلية الإجراءات الخاصة لمجلس حقوق الإنسان للتابع للأمم المتحدة. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. Thank you. Apologies for the difficulties again. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Pakistan on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. President. The OIC thanks the High Commissioner for his oral update, and we echo his concerns regarding the dwindling respect for international law and the multilateral institutions. Despite the UN system's shortcomings, it is now ever more pertinent to buttress our efforts to strengthen it. We agree with the High Commissioner that lack of accountability and impunity is a recipe for disaster. The disastrous situation in occupied Palestine is emblematic of the failure of the UN system to hold the perpetrator accountable and puts into question the efficacy of this entire system. As the ceasefire has taken effect, as tenuous as it may be, it is high time for the international community to step up its efforts to help and support the Palestinians in the wake of the unspeakable brutalities endured by them. While the OIC has and will continue to condemn in the strongest terms all crimes committed by the Israeli occupation forces, we underline that any further steps taken in this context must be in line with the international law and the just aspirations of the Palestinian people. We reiterate our call for the implementation of ICJ's judgments and remind all states of their responsibilities in this context. Mr. President, the human rights situation in occupied Jammu and Kashmir remains a matter of deep anguish. We urge India to comply with the applicable UNSC resolutions and implement recommendations addressed to it in the 2 Kashmir reports by OHCHR, which need to be updated. We urge the Council to pay attention to repeated observations made by special procedure mandate holders on the human rights violations and impunity in the occupied territory. The OIC also calls on this Council to work towards securing justice and accountability for the Rohingya people, including through their safe, dignified, and voluntary return to their homes in Myanmar. The OIC reiterates its full solidarity with Bangladesh and supports calls for assistance to Bangladesh in efforts to achieving a durable solution. The OIC condemns the damage and loss of properties inflicted by Armenia, including cultural heritage and religious sites in the territories of Azerbaijan liberated from the occupation. The OIC reaffirms its full support to the government and people of Azerbaijan in their efforts to rehabilitate and rebuild the liberated territories. Lastly, we want to spotlight the global attention towards the rising xenophobia and particularly anti-Muslim hatred increasingly being peddled by some of their electoral ambitions. This alarming rise in such provocative actions must be stemmed. I thank you, sir.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union on behalf of a group of countries.
President, I'm making this statement on behalf of a group of 44 countries. We welcome Ethiopia as a member of the Human Rights Council. We appreciated Ethiopia's constructive engagement at the 4th cycle of the UPR in November 24. We continue to encourage all parties to engage in peaceful negotiations and dialogue to prevent further human rights violations and abuses and to restore peace, especially in the Amhara and Oromia regions. In Tigray, the Pretoria Agreement remains the cornerstone of peace and stability. We strongly call on all parties to resolve their disputes peacefully and implement the outstanding provisions of the Cessation of Hostilities Agreement. We call on Ethiopia to demonstrate its commitment to transitional justice by taking decisive steps to ensure accountability. We stand ready to support Ethiopia to ensure a credible, transparent and independent transitional justice process and call for the adoption and implementation of the transitional justice draft laws consistent with international human rights standards. We underline the role of the Ethiopian Commission of Human Rights, whose independence is of paramount importance. A clear delineation of roles between truth-seeking, reconciliation initiatives, amnesties, reparations, and efforts to locate missing persons is essential. We urge Ethiopia to reconsider the inclusion of capital punishment in the draft proclamation on fundamental crimes committed in violation of international law. We remain concerned about the challenging human rights situation in Ethiopia, including freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and the silencing of journalists, human rights defenders, and civil society. We remain deeply concerned by the suspension of several Ethiopian human rights NGOs and call on Ethiopia to cease any activities curtailing their ability to fulfill their crucial role. We continue to be alarmed by the high number of human rights violations and abuses by both state and non-state actors, as recorded by the Office of the High Commissioner in 2024. We encourage the government of Ethiopia to take advantage of the technical assistance available and encourage the Office of the High Commissioner to continue to monitor the situation and keep this council informed. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Liban au nom d'un groupe des États membres de la francophonie.
Monsieur le Président, cette déclaration est lue au nom du groupe francophone. Ces dernières semaines, des voix et initiatives se sont fait jour au sein de l'espace public mondial pour discréditer le droit international et la création des Nations Unies à la survie de l'humanité, nous nous alarmons de gestes irréversibles qui remettent en cause certains circuits cruciaux pour la sécurité globale, la solidarité humanitaire, la santé mondiale, la coopération technique et scientifique ou la lutte contre le réchauffement climatique. Ce sont des dizaines de millions de femmes, hommes et enfants qui se trouvent menacés, fragilisés, parfois condamnés. Ce sont aussi nos valeurs communes qui sont attaquées, dont la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme ainsi que la Charte des Nations unies. Nous tenons à affirmer solennellement notre attachement aux droits fondamentaux tels que portés par la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et notre volonté de poursuivre la construction d'un multilatéralisme respectueux du dialogue de chaque nation et considéré à égalité de toutes les populations dans leur pluralité sociale, culturelle et linguistique. À travers toute sa diversité, notre groupe mesure le rôle essentiel de l'interdépendance et du respect dans les relations entre les peuples et appelle à la vigilance face aux périls incommensurables auxquels conduira inévitablement la dégradation du système multilatéral. Appelle les autres groupes régionaux et interrégionaux à unir nos voix pour rappeler notre attachement commun aux droits fondamentaux, socle du multilatéralisme. Et enfin, salue l'action de l'ONU et du Haut Commissariat aux droits de l'homme et les encourage à poursuivre sans relâche leurs efforts au service de la dignité humaine et d'un monde préservé des fléaux du passé. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. President. We are delivering this statement on behalf of a group of like-minded countries. We remain committed to supporting the important work of the Human Rights Council and the ongoing efforts to promote universal respect for all human rights for all. As the Council nears its 19th year since succeeding the Human Rights Commission, we are reminded of its mandate to address past shortcomings, uphold human rights, and promote justice, dignity, and equality, guided by universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity, free from double standards and politicization. It should maintain its role as a platform for constructive dialogue and international cooperation to protect and enhance human rights. We are far from where we need to be, and much work lies ahead to stay true to the foundational principles of the Council. With this in mind, we express concern that the focus of the Council appears to prioritize certain rights over others, and that there may be an undue emphasis on specific countries, particularly those from the Global South. We respectfully urge the Council to continue to fulfill its mandate by promoting universal respect for all human rights in full alignment with the purposes and principles outlined in the UN Charter and related resolutions. Furthermore, we urge the Council to uphold the core principles of universality, interdependence, indivisibility, and the interrelatedness of all human rights, ensuring that all human rights, including the right to development, are treated in a fair and equal manner, on the same footing and with the same emphasis, and that no rights are overlooked or marginalized, and that the national and regional specificities and the different historical, cultural, and religious backgrounds are taken into account. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Republic of Tanzania on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Geneva Support Group of Western Sahara. The group continues to be extremely concerned with the continued denial of the right to self-determination for the people of Western Sahara, placed under partial occupation by Morocco since 1975, despite the United Nations General Assembly repeated calls since 1965 until today. The denial of this right constitutes a grave violation of human rights, and the international community must bear its responsibility for those people still living under colonial or alien domination or foreign occupation. For the 9th consecutive year, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has been denied access to Western Sahara. As highlighted by the UN Secretary General in his report to the UN Security Council of October 2024, this is despite multiple official requests and despite the Security Council in its resolution 2703 of 2023, urging enhanced cooperation, including through facilitating such visits. Adding to this human rights crisis is the exclusion of international organizations and observers from the region, coupled with the continued repression and targeting of local defenders attempting to document and monitor the situation in the absence of international oversight. Established to oversee the promised referendum, MINURSO is the only UN mission without a mandate to report on human rights. In October 2024, the Court of Justice of the European Union affirmatively confirmed the annulment of the EU-Morocco agreements, which illegally included Western Sahara. Morocco's exploitation of resources in Western Sahara directly violates the Sahrawi people's right of self-determination. Mr. President, we call on all states to strengthen and uphold international legality by promoting multilateralism and respect for international law as the only guarantee of peace and international justice. We warn against any unilateral decisions in which recognizes an illegal situation resulting from the breach of the right to self-determination. Whilst breaching international law, such steps only serve to delay a peaceful resolution to the conflict. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Suisse.
Monsieur le Président, la Suisse remercie le Haut-Commissaire pour ses activités durant la période en question. Face à des développements préoccupants en Algérie, la Suisse appelle les autorités à garantir et protéger le droit à la liberté d'expression de la presse. Il est nécessaire d'abroger les dispositions légales qui permettent des sanctions discrétionnaires, comme le recommande notamment la rapporteure spéciale sur la situation des défenseurs des droits de l'homme. La Suisse est préoccupée par les restrictions persistantes au droit à la liberté de réunion, d'association pacifique et d'expression au Tadjikistan. Les récentes mesures législatives et administratives imposent des exigences élevées qui entravent la capacité de la société civile, en particulier les ONG, à fonctionner librement. La Suisse appelle le Tadjikistan à respecter ses engagements internationaux, et à garantir un espace d'expression libre pour la société civile, les médias et le grand public. La Suisse salue la collaboration du gouvernement intérimaire du Bangladesh avec le Bureau du Haut-Commissariat aux droits de l'homme pour garantir la reddition des comptes des violations des droits de l'homme, notamment ceux commises entre le 1er juillet et le 15 août 2024, dans l'optique d'une réconciliation durable au Bangladesh. Et souligne l'importance d'adopter une approche inclusive, durable et centrée sur les victimes dans le cadre de la justice transitionnelle. La répression croissante des journalistes et des acteurs de la société civile en Azerbaïdjan est alarmante, notamment dans le contexte de la 29e conférence des Nations Unies sur les changements climatiques. Nous demandons aux autorités de libérer immédiatement toutes les personnes détenues arbitrairement et de garantir la liberté et protection des médias indépendants. Aux États-Unis, la Suisse exprime sa vive préoccupation face à l'ordre exécutif du 20 janvier qui prévoit un renforcement de la peine de mort au niveau fédéral et des États. La peine de mort va à l'encontre des droits de l'homme et de la dignité humaine en enfreignant, entre autres, le droit fondamental à la vie. À ce jour, il n'est pas démontré que la peine de mort ait un effet dissuasif sur la criminalité par rapport à d'autres peines de prison sévères. La Suisse réitère son opposition absolue à la peine de mort en tout lieu.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar. Qatar.
السيد الرئيس، إن ما خلفه العدوان الإسرائيلي الأخير على قطاع غزة من جرائم إبادة وانتهاكات جسيمة لم تشهد له البشرية مثيلا في التاريخ القريب، وستستمر أثاره وتداعياته الكارثية إلى أمد غير معلوم. حرصت دولة قطر مع شركائها منذ بداية العدوان الإسرائيلي على بذل جهود وساطة تكللت بالتوصل إلى اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار وتبادل المحتجزين والأسرى، ونأمل أن يمهد تنفيذ هذا الاتفاق الطريق لبدء عملية سياسية جادة تؤدي إلى سلام شامل وعادل للقضية الفلسطينية، بما يحقق تقرير المصير للشعب الفلسطيني الشقيق ويضمن إقامة دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة على حدود 67. ونحذر من أن عدم التزام تطبيق كافة بنود الاتفاق ودعوات التهجير القسري من قطاع غزة وتصاعد الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية ستعرض الأمن والاستقرار في منطقة الشرق الأوسط والعالم إلى مزيد من الخطر. نهنئ الشعب السوري الشقيق بانتصار ثورته، ونأمل أن يكون مؤشر لبدء مرحلة جديدة تلبي تطلعات الشعب السوري وتضمن تحقيق العدالة الانتقالية ومساءلة جميع المسؤولين عن الانتهاكات التي ارتكبت بحقهم. كما ترحب بلادي بالخطوات التي تقوم بها الإدارة السورية الجديدة لإعادة هيكلة الدولة وتحقيق الاستقرار، وانعقاد مؤتمر الحوار الوطني السوري كخطوة هامة نحو تعزيز التوافق الوطني والانتقال السلمي للسلطة من خلال عملية سياسية شاملة بقيادة سورية، والمضي قدما في بناء دولة القانون والمؤسسات وتعزيز الحريات الأساسية في البلاد. وندعو المجتمع الدولي إلى مواصلة دعم سوريا ورفع العقوبات، ونشجع مختلف آليات حقوق الإنسان على تقديم الدعم الفني لمساعدة الحكومة الانتقالية السورية على الوفاء بالتزاماتها في تعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان. شكرا السيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. Germany thanks the High Commissioner for his update. We welcome the establishment of a ceasefire in Gaza. However, we would like to underline that compliance with human rights law and international humanitarian law by all parties remains crucial, not only in Gaza, but also in all the occupied Palestinian territories. A negotiated two-state solution remains the only solution which will enable both Palestinians and Israelis to live in peace, security, and dignity. We continue to condemn Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine in the strongest possible terms. Let me be very clear. Russia is the aggressor of this war. Russia is responsible for large-scale human rights violations, and Russia must be held accountable for these horrific deeds. That is the path toward a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace. Mr. President, we find ourselves at a critical juncture in the Council's history. Authoritarian forces are threatening the Council's crucial contribution to the protection and promotion of human rights. Work that matters for the people in South Sudan, who are suffering conflict-related atrocities, and for the people of Syria, who now have the historical opportunity to build for themselves a future in freedom and justice. Your efforts also shine a light on human rights situations that are not in the international spotlight. Now, more than ever, we need strong United Nations and a strong United Nations human rights system. Therefore, Germany will continue to support the Council and the High Commissioner politically and financially. We have already contributed several million euros upfront to the OHCHR in 2025, and we will call on other member states to follow this example. Ultimately, increased efficiency and coordination of the UN agencies will be key. We need to be able to do the same with less. Mr. President, human rights are under pressure everywhere and in every aspect, which is why Germany continues to be strongly engaged on both economic, social and cultural rights, as well as on civil and political rights. In a few weeks, the UN will celebrate World Water Day. The right to safe drinking water is possibly one of the most violated human rights worldwide. Germany, as the co-penholder of the thematic resolution on water and sanitation, remains strongly committed to promoting the right to safe drinking water. In many parts of the world, we witness continued violation of the rights to freedom of assembly and freedom of expression. We are particularly worried about the developments in Georgia. Grave concerns also apply to the situation in the Russian Federation.
I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Thank you. Mr. High Commissioner, thank you for your updates on human rights situations of utmost concern. We appreciate your relentless work to steadily promote and protect the rights of everyone and everywhere. Your work and that of your office are all the more important in the destructive process of systematic undermining of international human rights and humanitarian law. The role of the Council in addressing human rights crises around the globe is vital. Czechia, a committed supporter of the UN human rights system, including this Council and its mechanism, has once again become its proud member. We will further promote fundamental rights, namely the right to equal participation, rights to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, freedom of expression and of information. We will strive to ensure that the digital technologies won't be misused to suppress or restrict human rights. Mr. President, we are already marking the third anniversary of Russia's illegal full-scale invasion of Ukraine and 11 years since Russia launched its aggression in Ukraine, with thousands of civilian casualties and disastrous consequences for the enjoyment of human rights by civilian populations. Many of Russia's atrocities amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. We must hold Russia fully accountable. We are seriously concerned by the systematic violence and repression against political opposition, civil society, and the media, and violation of freedoms of expression and of assembly and association in Georgia. Our experience underscores the importance of safeguarding these freedoms. We are determined to ensure the right to peaceful assembly for all. Together with our international partners, Czechia will work hard to support the efficient functioning of the Council and contribute to the fulfillment of its numerous tasks, including upholding the independence and autonomy of your office, Mr. High Commissioner, as well as its financial stability. Thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Maroc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Ma délégation saisit cette occasion pour réitérer l'engagement du Royaume du Maroc en faveur des droits de l'homme et d'apporter sa contribution à la promotion de leur respect. C'est dans cet esprit que le Maroc a présenté cette année 2 engagements nationaux majeurs relatifs d'une part à l'organisation d'un colloque régional pour encourager la ratification de la Convention sur les disparitions forcées et de la mise en œuvre de ces dispositions, ainsi que l'inscription de la disparition forcée dans la législation nationale pénale comme un crime indépendant et un crime contre l'humanité. De surcroît, notamment en partenariat avec le Paraguay et le Portugal, le Maroc s'est activé à abriter cette année l'année dernière, la 10e édition du dialogue de Glion sur les droits de l'homme, qui s'est caractérisé à Marrakech en octobre dernier par l'adoption du cadre d'orientation de Marrakech pour la création et le développement de mécanismes nationaux efficaces. Au cours de cette présente session maintenant, et dans la continuité de son action de promotion de la diplomatie féminine dans les droits de l'homme, le Maroc, avec d'autres partenaires, présentera également un projet de résolution visant à institutionnaliser la célébration à Genève de la Journée internationale des femmes dans la diplomatie. Dans mon pays, l'année 2024 a été marquée par le lancement du processus de révision du Code de la famille, qui constitue l'une des réformes majeures également, à travers une approche réfléchie et équilibrée pour l'émancipation et les droits de la femme. En outre, pour doter le Maroc d'un cadre juridique moderne, en phase avec les meilleurs standards internationaux en matière des droits de l'homme, des projets de code pénal et de loi relatives à la procédure pénale font actuellement l'objet d'un débat constructif entre le gouvernement, les parlementaires et les professionnels du secteur. À signaler enfin l'adoption de la loi organique récemment, la loi organique relative à la définition des conditions et des modalités d'exercice du droit de grève, ainsi que l'entrée en vigueur de la loi sur les peines alternatives qui se révèle désormais indispensable pour répondre aux impératifs contemporains des politiques pénales. Je vous remercie, Monsieur le Président.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Espagne.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. España se une a las declaraciones formuladas por Dinamarca, por la Unión Europea y también por Tailandia. Agradecemos al alto comisionado su informe, saludamos la profundidad de su análisis y nos tememos que tenemos que compartir la honda preocupación que refleja por la situación de los derechos humanos en el mundo. Los países que nos sentamos en esta sala conocemos la importancia que tiene el trabajo del Consejo y de sus mecanismos. Nos acompañan en la obligación que tiene todo gobierno de situar los derechos humanos en el centro de sus políticas. Disociarse de este Consejo, como han anunciado que harían 3 estados, supone renunciar a seguir avanzando en los derechos humanos, el pilar fundamental para garantizar sociedades justas y cohesionadas. España apoya la labor de alerta temprana, de cooperación y denuncia del Consejo, irrenunciable también en situaciones que van a ser objeto de su trabajo en esta sesión, como Ucrania, territorios palestinos ocupados, Sudán, Nicaragua o Afganistán. Como dijo el alto comisionado, las represalias y ataques contra la sociedad civil no han hecho más que aumentar. Quiero trasladar el firme apoyo de España a todas las personas defensoras de los derechos humanos, también aquellas que realizan su labor en situaciones remotas, y recordar la importancia de que puedan participar en estas sesiones. Sin su voz, sin la voz de la sociedad civil, ningún avance será completo ni sostenible. Los retrocesos en los derechos de las mujeres y las niñas no pueden continuar. Se priva a la mitad de la población de sus derechos fundamentales, lo que constituye una manifestación gravísima de injusticia, el más vil ataque a la dignidad y, además, lastra el progreso de nuestras sociedades de manera irreversible. Seguiremos a la vanguardia de los esfuerzos para integrar la perspectiva de género en todos los trabajos del Consejo, impulsando el diálogo y la cooperación que fortalezcan los derechos de las mujeres y las niñas y su participación en todo espacio público. Millones de ciudadanos han luchado durante generaciones para lograr lo que hoy se conoce como derechos civiles y políticos. Vamos a seguir peleando por ellos, pero también vamos a seguir peleando por los derechos económicos, sociales y culturales. No hay jerarquía entre ambas categorías. No hay subordinación ni dependencia de uno respecto de otros. Estamos convencidos de que la labor de la Oficina del Alto Comisionado, su independencia, integridad de su mandato son imprescindibles. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant du Costa Rica.
Gracias, señor presidente. Costa Rica agradece los informes del Alto Comisionado y reafirma su compromiso con su oficina. Para mi país, la protección y promoción de todos los derechos humanos debe ser la base fundamental de toda democracia. En el actual patrón global de desmantelamiento de democracias, el ataque directo a los derechos humanos y al sistema universal es la principal táctica de erosión del Estado de Derecho. La oficina juega un papel crucial para fortalecer los valores democráticos, incluyendo a través de su apoyo al desarrollo y fortalecimiento de sistemas de alerta temprana, asistencia técnica y creación de capacidad, y la coordinación con otros organismos de Naciones Unidas. Señor presidente, el derecho a la protesta pacífica y la libertad de expresión son pilares fundamentales de toda sociedad democrática. En un mundo donde el espacio cívico se encuentra cada vez más amenazado, debemos garantizar que todas las personas puedan expresar sus ideas sin temor a represalias, facilitando la protesta pacífica, también en línea. La criminalización de los protestantes pacíficos y de defensores de derechos humanos, su vigilancia arbitraria y la censura atentan contra el derecho internacional y debilitan las democracias y los derechos humanos. Mi país solicita al Alto Comisionado que redoble esfuerzos en la alerta temprana de acciones que quieran restringir el derecho a la protesta pacífica y la libertad de expresión, y promover que las fuerzas de seguridad faciliten adecuadamente el ejercicio de estos derechos. Para Costa Rica, la promoción constante del diálogo entre todos los actores sociales es una herramienta clave para prevenir conflictos y consolidar la paz. Costa Rica insta a este Consejo a continuar apoyando al Alto Comisionado y su oficina de manera decidida en la defensa del espacio cívico y del trabajo de los defensores de derechos humanos como garantías indispensables para sostener sociedades democráticas, libres y justas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to express my sincere appreciation for the dedicated efforts of the High Commissioner and recognize the increasingly crucial role of OHCHR in the global protection and promotion of human rights. It is essential for all nations to uphold universal values such as human rights, freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Japan is committed to enhancing its cooperation with OHCHR and further contributing to the presentation of the international order based on the rule of law. We need to firmly speak out against serious human rights violations. It is vital to strengthen bilateral dialogue and cooperation to support and encourage countries that are making efforts to promote and protect human rights and democracy. As an example of such dialogue and cooperation, we welcome the steps taken by the new government of Sri Lanka towards national reconciliation, including the development of an open domestic mechanism by strengthening its truth and reconciliation framework and its active engagement to develop infrastructure and livelihoods in the northern and eastern provinces. We also recognize the efforts of the government of Sri Lanka to implement social protection measures to compensate for the cumulative impacts of the economic crisis, associated austerity measures that have affected socio-economically vulnerable communities. Japan will continue to support Sri Lanka's own initiative to improve its human rights situation in a concrete and tangible manner, and to further promote confidence-building measures that contribute to national reconciliation. Mr. President, we regret the recent deportation of Uyghurs from Thailand to China. We emphasize that those deported Uyghurs have to be able to receive fair and humane treatment in China, and that human rights must be protected. We remain steadfast in our commitment to working with the international community and civil society to promote and protect human rights, guided by the principle of human security and the concept of leaving no one behind. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradezco al Alto Comisionado por la intervención. Estamos enfrentando una situación sin precedentes a nivel global, donde se combina un recrudecimiento de la violencia armada y las violaciones a los derechos humanos con un ataque a las instituciones multilaterales encargadas de promover y defender los derechos humanos. En este contexto, lamentamos que varios países hayan decidido salirse del Consejo de Derechos Humanos, dándole así la espalda a un espacio de diálogo abierto y transparente. México fue uno de los países que impulsó la creación del Consejo y que ha contribuido significativamente a su fortalecimiento en los últimos 20 años. Por ello, hoy reafirmamos nuestro compromiso con este órgano esencial de las Naciones Unidas. Reiteramos también nuestro respaldo a la Oficina del Alto Comisionado para continuar promoviendo los derechos humanos y proteger los avances que hemos logrado. Agradecemos especialmente el apoyo que brindan sus oficinas en el terreno. Instamos a los estados, los organismos internacionales, las organizaciones de la sociedad civil, la academia y el sector privado a alzar la voz en defensa de los derechos humanos y a buscar espacios de cooperación y financiamiento para que esta agenda común siga su camino en beneficio de todas las personas. Como miembros del Consejo, seguiremos promoviendo la igualdad de género, los derechos sexuales y reproductivos, la participación de mujeres y niñas y el combate contra la discriminación, incluyendo por motivos de orientación sexual e identidad de género. Defenderemos también los derechos de las personas migrantes que están bajo ataque y continuaremos promoviendo los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, los afrodescendientes, las personas con discapacidad, la niñez y las personas mayores. La voz de la comunidad internacional, de las Naciones Unidas, del Alto Comisionado y de los procedimientos especiales debe escucharse fuerte y claro. No aceptaremos retrocesos. Gracias, señor presidente.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de l'Algérie.
شكرا. يشكر وفد بلادي المفوض السامي على تقديم إحاطته حول أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في العالم. تأتي هذه الجلسة في وقت يواجه فيه عالم من العديد من المظاهر والتحديات التي اقترنت بمآسي إنسانية ناتجة خصوصا عن انتشار النزاعات المسلحة والاحتلال طويل الأمد كما هو الشأن في الأراضي الفلسطينية وإقليم الصحراء الغربية. كما تعرب الجزائر عن قلقها إزاء استمرار تفاقم الوضع الإنساني في الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة نتيجة حرب الإبادة الجماعية التي يمارسها الاحتلال الإسرائيلي منذ أكتوبر 2023 والتي لا تزال تبعاتها مستمرة رغم توصل جهود الوساطة الدولية إلى اتفاق وقف إطلاق النار. ولا يزال وفد بلادي يشعر بقلق بالغ إزاء الانتهاكات الممنهجة لحقوق الإنسان وانتهاكات القانون الدولي الإنساني في إقليم الصحراء الغربية المحتل، ويدعو إلى مراقبة وتوثيق الانتهاكات هذه كلها، ويحث المفوض السامي على إرسال بعثة لتقصي الحقائق إلى المنطقة وتقديم تقرير موسع إلى المجلس بشأنها. السيد الرئيس، تؤمن الجزائر بالعمل المتعدد الأطراف وتدعمه في جميع الهيئات الدولية والإقليمية بما فيها العاملة في مجال حقوق الإنسان. وفي هذا الإطار قدمت الجزائر الشهر الفارط بصفة طوعية تقرير منتصف المدة لآلية الاستعراض الدوري الشامل، واستقبلت كذلك السيد كليمون بول المقرر الخاص المعني بحرية التجمع السلمي وتكوين الجمعيات، والسيدة ماري لاولور المقررة الأممية الخاصة المعنية بالمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان على التوالي في سبتمبر وديسمبر 2023. ولم يتوقف التزامنا عند هذا الحد، بل تم تجسيد توصيات المقررين الخاصين من خلال سن تعديلات خاصة في قانون العقوبات، حيث تم تعديل نص المادة 87 مكرر والمادة 96 من هذا القانون المتعلق بالجرائم الموصوفة إرهابية وتخريبية. كما تم المصادقة على مرسوم يحدد القواعد التنظيمية للمرصد الوطني للوقاية من التمييز وخطاب الكراهية، ووضعه تحت وصاية الجمهورية رئيس الجمهورية. وفيما يخص الطفولة التي تعد من أولويات السيد رئيس الجمهورية.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the High Commissioner for his global update. Regarding the situation in Israel and the Palestinian territories, we refer to our statement delivered during the respective interactive dialogue with the High Commissioner. Mr. President, we are deeply concerned about the deportation of a group of Uyghur refugees by Thailand to China last week in disregard of the principle of non-refoulement. UN experts concluded that they are at real risk of torture or other punishment upon return, and we call on China to guarantee their rights. The systemic oppression of Afghan women and girls has long reached an alarming level. The future of Afghan society looks bleak when women and girls continue to be erased from public life. No steps toward normalization should be taken without significant improvement of their situation. We continue to urge Afghanistan to adhere to international human rights law, including CEDAW, and adhere utmost importance to accountability for any violations. The state of civic space in Venezuela continues to be a source of serious concern, particularly with regards to the recent adoption of the NGO law, which impacts freedom of association and the right to engage in public affairs. Critical or dissenting voices run a constant risk of persecution by the authorities. The Kingdom of the Netherlands calls on Venezuela to unconditionally release those arbitrarily detained and to uphold the human rights of all Venezuelans, particularly activists, journalists, human rights defenders, and members of the opposition. Mr. President, lastly, in Syria there are signs of hope, and we are grateful to see a real opportunity for a more peaceful and inclusive Syrian society, a society in which justice and accountability is served, and where people can finally rebuild their country in peace, a country with a vibrant civil society based on a functioning rule of law and human rights protection and promotion. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Gambia.
Mr. President, the Gambia thanks the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the global update and reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights for all. We remain deeply concerned about the ongoing atrocities against civilians in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sudan, Myanmar, and in the occupied Palestinian territory, most especially. The widespread human rights violations, mass displacement, and systemic acts of violence against these populations demand urgent and sustained action. In particular, we are deeply alarmed by credible reports indicating that crimes amounting to genocide may be occurring in Myanmar and the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. As highlighted by various human rights organizations and legal proceedings, including the case of South Africa versus Israel before the International Court of Justice and the Gambia versus Myanmar, also before the ICJ. There is compelling evidence that inhuman acts have been committed as part of widespread or systemic attacks against civilian populations. These acts necessitated urgent preventative measures in accordance with international legal obligations. At a time of increasing global challenges, we emphasize the urgent need for multilateralism, accountability, and technical cooperation to support states in fulfilling their human rights obligations. Domestically, the Gambia continues to prioritize the rule of law, institutional reforms, and transitional justice to ensure that human rights remain central to national policies. The Council must remain impartial, effective, and responsive to grave human rights violations, ensuring that its mechanisms serve the cause of justice, accountability, and protection for all people. The Gambia stands firm in its commitment to a just and inclusive global human rights system underpinned by respect for human dignity, international law, and accountability. And I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor presidente. Agradecemos al alto comisionado la actualización global clara y contundente que nos presentó en el día de hoy. A 80 años de la creación de Naciones Unidas, no podemos sino observar con preocupación el escenario global al que nos enfrentamos. En este respecto, quisiéramos, por una parte, reiterar nuestro apoyo al mandato del alto comisionado y su oficina, que es innegable que hoy su función resulta más trascendental que nunca. Me gustaría detenerme en la necesidad de reforzar la interconexión entre los pilares de Naciones Unidas, específicamente entre el pilar de paz y seguridad y el pilar de derechos humanos. Como bien señaló el alto comisionado el día de hoy, debemos trabajar en construir una paz fundada en los derechos humanos. Y para construir dicha paz es necesario que las violaciones de los derechos humanos sean enfrentadas con un sistema de rendición de cuentas efectivo y robusto, donde la impunidad no sea una opción y los estados puedan avanzar en procesos de justicia transicional reales. Debemos actuar de manera colectiva y coordinada para prevenir violaciones de derechos humanos, investigar y sancionar a los responsables y brindar asistencia y reparación a las víctimas. Coincidimos plenamente con la libertad de prensa, la independencia judicial y las elecciones periódicas libres y democráticas son pilares fundamentales para la protección y promoción de los derechos humanos. La falta de las mismas socava la confianza de la ciudadanía en las instituciones, polariza la sociedad y debilita la capacidad del Estado para garantizar la seguridad, la justicia y el bienestar ciudadano. En dicho contexto, destacamos la necesidad de respetar los espacios que los propios países creamos para discutir los temas de derechos humanos, con independencia de si por momentos ello resulta inconveniente. Por ello, consideramos muy lamentable que dos países que están bajo análisis en el ítem 2 hayan decidido retirarse de este Consejo. La participación activa y constructiva de los Estados en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos es esencial para fortalecer su eficacia y legitimidad, así como resguardar la arquitectura internacional que nos ha dado marcos normativos claros y equitativos para resguardar la dignidad humana durante las últimas 8 décadas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the High Commissioner for the update and express our unwavering support for his office. A few days before, we marked the 3-year anniversary of Russian full-scale aggression of Ukraine, which has inflicted immense suffering on Ukrainian people. We condemned the deliberate Russian attacks on civilians and critical infrastructure, use of torture, arbitrary detention, children abduction, sexual and gender-based violence, and violation of international law. Albania remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine and will continue to advocate for peace and stability in the region. The ceasefire in Gaza is an enormous relief. We must now be fully implemented. All hostages need to be released and permanent end of hostility should be ensured. Albania is committed to a comprehensive, just and lasting peace based on the two-state solution. We are witness of significant political and social changes that are undergoing in Syria. The recent fall of Bashar al-Assad regime and the creation of the new transition government is the first step towards a successful political transition. We call on all parties to work for a peaceful and inclusive solution to the conflict. We are now on the 4th year of Taliban's takeover of power, and the situation in Afghanistan has been deteriorating. The systematic oppression of women and girls, the shrinking of civil space, and the marginalization of minorities are alarming developments that require full attention of the international community. We welcome the progress made by the International Criminal Court and other international bodies in seeking justice for crimes committed against Afghan women and girls. In Sudan, the humanitarian crisis has worsened, with millions displaced and in urgent need of aid. In Yemen, the ongoing conflict has led to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. In Myanmar, the persecution of Rohingya people remains a grave concern, with ongoing reports of violence and displacement. Albania reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the universal respect, protection, and fulfillment of human rights for everyone. We will work tirelessly to combat all forms of discrimination, to end impunity, and to ensure accountability for all violations of human rights throughout all the world. I thank you.
Merci. Je donne la parole au distingué représentant de la Belgique.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Les droits humains et l'état de droit sont les fondements de nos sociétés. Leur mise en œuvre et le respect de ces droits permettraient de résoudre les nombreuses crises décrites par le Haut-Commissaire. Comme il l'a indiqué, en se basant sur les faits, la redevabilité et un socle de valeurs, leur effet préventif est indéniable. La Belgique reste une fervente partisane de l'indépendance du Haut-Commissariat et du rôle du Haut-Commissaire, auquel nous réitérons notre plein soutien. Nous soutenons le renforcement de la présence du bureau du Haut-Commissaire sur le terrain. Avec près de 50% du personnel déployé hors du siège, une présence est assurée au plus près des bénéficiaires dans plus de 90 localisations. Nous appelons également tous les pays à coopérer pleinement avec le Haut-Commissariat, ses représentants sur le terrain, ainsi qu'avec l'ensemble de ces mécanismes. Monsieur le Président, nous remercions le Haut-Commissariat pour la mise à jour sur le Guatemala, le Honduras et la Colombie. Comme lui, nous accueillons positivement l'élan renouvelé pour la mise en œuvre de l'accord de paix en Colombie, ainsi que les progrès constatés en matière d'espace civique. Nous regrettons que le retrait américain mette en péril la viabilité de ces projets, ainsi que d'autres partout dans le monde. Je souhaite réitérer aussi l'importance que mon pays attache à l'espace civique et au rôle de la société civile dans nos travaux et au sein de chacun de nos États. Comme évoqué par le Haut-Commissaire, il s'agit d'un élément essentiel pour garantir les fondements démocratiques, notamment en Syrie. À ce titre, nous condamnons en Géorgie les actes de violence à l'encontre de manifestants pacifiques, de représentants des médias et d'hommes politiques. Nous appelons également les autorités tunisiennes à mettre fin à l'intimidation, aux persécutions politiques et aux mauvais traitements. Enfin, la Belgique s'associe pleinement avec la déclaration du Danemark, notamment en ce qui concerne la Russie. Nous condamnons fermement la guerre d'agression qu'elle mène à l'encontre de l'Ukraine, de même que la répression interne accrue qui y est associée. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Maldives.
Mr. President, the Maldives thanks the High Commissioner for the comprehensive reports presented to this Council. We recognize the critical link between human rights and climate change as highlighted by the High Commissioner. Having led the efforts to recognize the right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, the Maldives continue to advocate for its operationalization at both national and international levels. We also share the High Commissioner's commitment to addressing the human rights implications of digitalization. The Maldives is navigating the challenges and opportunities of the digital age while maximizing its potential for development. Through the Digital Maldives program, we are equipping youth with the skills to excel in the digital economy, fostering innovation and economic diversification. Efforts are also being undertaken to safeguard customer rights, reinforcing data privacy and security. Recognizing the pivotal role of the High Commissioner's Office in advancing the global human rights agenda, the Maldives reaffirms its unwavering commitment to its mandate and the work of the Human Rights Council. We recently completed the second periodic review of ICCPR and submitted our second periodic report under the Convention Against Torture. Our commitment remains firm as we prepare for the upcoming reviews of CRC, CERD, CRPD, and the fourth cycle of the Universal Periodic Review this year. Mr. President, the Maldives echoes the concerns over the worsening human rights situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in Gaza. We stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their legitimate pursuit of self-determination and call for an independent sovereign state of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Ghana commends the High Commissioner for his bold leadership on human rights and accountability. We believe that the strong voice of the High Commissioner remains critical in upholding basic human rights during these turbulent times of geopolitical tensions, polarization, armed conflicts, and a deteriorating climate crisis. At this pivotal time, where many countries are exposed to heightened states of fragility, it is important for international cooperation to be deepened in support of efforts to address the widening inequalities which continue to deny many people access to education, health, decent employment, and justice. Mr. President, Ghana attaches great importance to her obligations under the Charter of the United Nations and other international treaties. To demonstrate this commitment, successive Ghanaian governments have initiated and implemented policies that uphold international human rights, both at home and abroad. We are therefore concerned about the erosion of individual liberties and violations of human rights in many places across the globe. It is regrettable that these human rights abuses affect mainly civilians with negative impacts on the vulnerable in society, particularly women, children, the aged, and persons with disability. Ghana calls on all governments to act in conformity with universally recognized human rights to demonstrate their commitment to international law. We also call upon all states to uphold multilateralism, solidarity, and genuine collaboration to promote and protect human rights. We recognize that every state has the sovereign right to determine its own development priorities in a manner that ensures its stability and progress. In this regard, Ghana reaffirms her support for the One China policy and is following with keen interest the socioeconomic developments, stability, ethnic solidarity, and religious harmony being promoted and enjoyed by the people of Xinjiang and Tibet. The human rights agenda can be strengthened if we prioritize constructive dialogue and cooperation. No one benefits when human rights are politicized or used as a weapon to undermine the sovereignty of any state. I thank you.
Merci. Ceci était la dernière intervention qui nous est possible d'écouter pendant cette réunion. Excellences, distingués collègues, ceci nous amène à la fin de cette réunion. Nous nous retrouvons cet après-midi à 14h30 pour poursuivre notre débat général sous le point 2. Je déclare close la 12e réunion de la 58e session du Conseil des droits de l'homme. Merci.
you.